Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories, where myth drifts into memory and ancient stories unfold softly enough to fall asleep to. Tonight, we're tracing the quiet echo of a name once spoken in thunder, a name that once meant protection, storm, and justice among the stars. It's the story of Ninurta, the forgotten Anunnaki warrior who, according to the oldest tablets ever written, may have once saved humanity from a world-ending flood. Not a myth, not quite a god, but something that lived in the uneasy space between legend and history. Someone whose memory the ages tried to bury, and yet, somehow, it still stirs in the silence of the stones. Before we begin, take a moment to settle wherever you are. Maybe you're lying in bed, a little tired, the hum of the evening still in your ears. Maybe the world around you is quiet now, the day gently slipping away. As you listen, I'd love to know, where are you right now? What time is it in your corner of the world? The ancient Mesopotamians once believed every hour had its own guardian spirit. So perhaps, wherever you are, one of those guardians is still listening, keeping time beside you. If you find this gentle journey through the myths of old soothing, or if it helps you drift off a little easier, I'd be ever so grateful if you'd leave a like or subscribe. It helps this small corner of calm find others who might need a peaceful pause too. So, as you settle in, let's begin the story of Ninurta, a god, a warrior, a forgotten protector, and perhaps one of the oldest symbols of courage the world ever imagined. In the beginning, the universe of the Sumerians was not filled with light, but with sound. It was a world spoken into being, where the voices of the gods created rivers, mountains and winds. Among them was Enlil, lord of the air, and his son Ninurta, born not of peace, but of storm. His name meant something like Lord of the Earth, though in those days the earth itself was still young, unsteady and often angry. They said he carried a weapon that could roar like thunder, one that could strike from the heavens and split mountains in half. It wasn't described as metal, not exactly, but as something alive, a talking mace called Sharur, a creation of such precision that it almost seemed mechanical. When people in the land of Sumer looked to the skies and saw lightning rip through clouds, they said that was Ninurta reminding them he still watched. But over time, even gods can fade. And while names like Enlil and Enki survived in temple hymns, Ninurta slowly dissolved into a whisper. It's strange to think about that, isn't it? The idea that entire civilizations once built temples for someone, sang to him, carved his image into stone, and then simply stopped saying his name. Maybe you've had that moment too, reading a name in an old book, one that once meant everything to someone, but now means almost nothing to anyone at all. Ninurta's story begins there, in that quiet space between reverence and forgetting. The Sumerians didn't think of their gods as distant. They saw them as part of the world, moving through wind, living in rivers, shaping mountains. And Ninurta wasn't a god of comfort. He was a god of balance. He punished, but he protected. He destroyed, but he restored. When the floods came, it was said that Ninurta fought to protect what remained of humankind, not out of pity, but out of duty to his father's creation. Some versions even suggest he was sent to calm the chaos that had swallowed the world, to bring back the order that had been lost. Imagine for a moment those ancient days, the Tigris and Euphrates overflowing, cities swallowed by rising water, the sound of thunder echoing across endless plains. To the people living there, such storms must have felt alive, intelligent, perhaps even merciful in their fury. And in that world, Ninurta wasn't a distant myth. He was the sound of survival. His earliest depictions are strange to modern eyes. He's often shown with wings, not decorative, but mechanical looking, like the panels of some lost design. In his hands, he carries a weapon that hums with energy, described not as a sword or spear, but something that speaks. The tablets never quite agree on what it was. Some say it could fly by itself, others say it could hear commands. The word used, Sharur, means the one that knows, or the talking weapon. It's difficult to read that without thinking of modern stories, of intelligent machines or technologies out of place in time. Of course, for the Sumerians, this wasn't technology, it was divinity. But as the centuries passed, these stories changed. In some, Ninurta became a humble god of farming, helping crops grow after the floods. In others, he remained the fierce protector who fought the Azag, a monstrous being said to bring disease and drought. His battles, carved into clay, were both cosmic and strangely human. They spoke not just of gods and monsters, but of storms and seasons, destruction and renewal, the kind of patterns we still live by, even if we don't call them divine anymore. There's something touching about that, isn't there? How stories that once described the cosmos now describe us. How a myth about a warrior god fighting chaos might also just be about a person fighting through their own difficult days. The Sumerians didn't see a difference. To them, the heavens and the heart were reflections of each other. When archaeologists began finding the tablets that mention Ninurta, they were often damaged, missing lines, the words faint from millennia of dust and damp. The first ones were unearthed in places like Nippur and Girsu, where once temples stood dedicated to him. There, among fragments of hymns and prayers, they found hints of a deeper story, one in which Ninurta, at great cost to himself, restored balance to a broken world after the Great Flood. Not as a hero in shining armour, but as a weary guardian doing what needed to be done. There's a quiet power in that, the idea of someone saving the world not for glory or reward, but simply because it had to be saved. You can almost picture the scene, a landscape of mud and ruin, rivers swollen, the sky still heavy with rain, the air thick with the scent of salt and clay. And through it all, a figure walking alone, carrying a weapon that hums with memory, trying to rebuild what was lost. In the silence of that image, you can feel the weight of ancient compassion, that even the gods, in their own way, might have known what it meant to protect, to care, to hope. There's an old hymn that survives in partial form. It says, "When the storm was silent, Ninurta took up the fields. He cleared the canals, he ordered the waters, he gave life back to the plain." It's not a grand myth. It's a quiet one. A story not about victory, but about repair. And perhaps that's why he was forgotten. In the centuries that followed, humanity began to favour gods of power, of empire, of control. The quieter protectors faded first. Those who simply kept the world in balance were replaced by those who promised dominion over it. But if you listen closely to later myths, in Akkadian hymns, in Assyrian prayers, even in scattered lines of the Hebrew text, you can still hear traces of him. A warrior who fought monsters of chaos, who defended humankind after the deluge, who wielded thunder yet sowed grain. His name changed, sometimes called Ningirsu, sometimes Ninib, sometimes something else entirely, but his essence remained, a reminder that strength isn't only in destruction, but in restoration. When you think about it, that pattern repeats itself throughout history. Names change, beliefs evolve, empires rise and fall, yet the core ideas remain. There's always someone who stands between order and chaos, between flood and famine, between despair and survival. Sometimes it's a mythic god, sometimes it's a nameless human. Either way, the role is the same. And maybe that's why stories like Ninurta's still matter, because they remind us that even in the oldest parts of our memory, long before science or scripture, we understood something essential, that protection and creation often come from the same place. It's humbling, too, to realise that these ancient people, who watch storms with fear and reverence, might have understood something about resilience that we've only recently begun to name again. They lived by the rhythm of rivers, by floods and droughts, by the slow rebuilding after disaster. For them, survival wasn't guaranteed. It was earned season by season, storm by storm. So when they told stories about Ninurta fighting chaos, it wasn't a distant fantasy. It was a way to make sense of their world, a way to believe that the forces beyond their control weren't random but guided, that someone, somewhere, cared enough to fight for balance. And maybe, in a quiet way, we still tell those same stories. We just give them new names: science, heroism, restoration. But the feeling beneath it is the same, that in every flood, literal or metaphorical, there's something within us that wants to rebuild. If you close your eyes for a moment, you can almost hear it. The hum of the old cities beneath layers of sand, the rustle of reeds along vanished canals, the distant murmur of a language that hasn't been spoken aloud in thousands of years. Somewhere in that sound, perhaps, Ninurta still walks. Not as a god waiting for worship, but as a symbol of quiet endurance. And maybe that's enough. Because while gods may fade, their lessons don't. The old tablets might crumble, the temples fall, the hymns go silent, but the feeling they tried to capture, that strange mix of awe and hope, still finds us. It finds us when we rebuild after loss, when we protect what we love, when we choose patience over fear. In the end, Ninurta's story isn't about war at all. It's about care, the fierce protective kind that keeps going long after the storm has passed. And as you drift deeper into the rhythm of this tale, you might start to sense how close those ancient minds still are. The same moon that watched over their floods now glows over your window. The same stars they thought were gods still cross our night sky, unchanged. Perhaps, somewhere among them, there's still one faint glimmer left for Ninurta, the forgotten warrior who saved humanity, not through conquest, but through compassion written in thunder. And as we move onward, we'll begin to follow his path from the heavens down to the earth, from divine warfare to the rebuilding of a world that needed its heroes to be humble. So breathe, settle, and let the old stories stay with you. The storm will quiet soon. Long before the first bricks of the ziggurats touched the sky, before even the earliest farmers pressed footprints into the wet soil of Sumer, the world was already a reflection of something much older, a memory of a struggle that was said to have taken place among the stars. In the ancient tablets they called it the time when the heavens were divided. It wasn't a single event, but a season of chaos so vast that even the gods themselves trembled. To the people who wrote those stories in symbols carved like tiny bird tracks, it was not just myth, it was explanation. Why the rivers flooded, why thunder rolled, why order had to be won again and again. If you imagine the sky as they once did, you can almost see it. Constellations not as shapes of animals or heroes, but as living signs of a forgotten war. The Sumerians believed that their gods were not born of silence. They were born of noise, of storms colliding, of waters clashing, of energy dividing itself into light and darkness. The heavens weren't peaceful. They were alive with conflict. At the heart of that struggle stood the great triad, Anu, Enlil and Enki, the sky, the air and the water. Between them lay balance, but also tension. Each ruled their realm with pride. Each carried within them a sense of duty that could turn to rivalry in an instant. Ninurta, as the son of Enlil, grew up in that shadow, the child of air and storm, born to bring order where chaos had taken root. In the earliest myths, the heavens were not a distant sky. They were close, just above the mountains, reachable by gods and sometimes by men. The stars were seen as dwellings, real places where beings of power could descend from and return to. When the heavens were said to have gone to war, it wasn't a poetic phrase. It was history as they knew it. The skies rumbled not just with thunder, but with intention. The old hymns speak of a rebellion, of younger gods who defied the order established by the elder ones. They called themselves the Igigi, celestial workers who grew weary of endless labour. They were said to have toiled in the heavens, maintaining the machinery of the cosmos, until they could bear it no longer. And when they rose up, their defiance shook the very foundation of creation. It was a story told in the rhythm of fear and awe, in the same tone we now reserve for comets, earthquakes, or storms that blot out the horizon. It was Enlil who was said to have quelled that first uprising, but not without cost. The harmony between heaven and earth had been broken, and from that fracture came a ripple that touched everything that lived. It's here that Ninurta first appears, not yet as the calm restorer of fields, but as a warrior of terrifying precision. His weapon, Sharur, wasn't described as an ornament of war, but as something that carried thought, that advised him, that could see beyond the horizon. Together they fought not against men, but against the very imbalance that had entered creation. When the old tablets describe those battles, their words feel both cosmic and strangely familiar. The enemy wasn't always a creature. Sometimes it was drought. Sometimes it was the creeping silence after a harvest failed. Sometimes it was the sickness that spread when rivers turned bitter. To the Sumerians, these were not coincidences. They were signs of conflict among the gods, the reflection of heavenly disorder playing out in the dust of the earth. And yet, beneath the grandeur of these celestial wars lies something deeply human. Each god's struggle mirrors a truth about existence itself. Enlil's control, Enki's wisdom, Anu's distance, and Ninurta's burden. He was the one sent to fix what others broke, to restore balance without glory. In that sense, his story is not just myth. It's an ancient reflection of responsibility, of how one act of restoration can matter more than 1,000 acts of destruction. You can picture those early storytellers, can't you? Sitting near fires made from river reeds, telling of the day when the sky itself roared, when lightning fell like spears and the earth cracked open as if it were alive. They didn't speak of galaxies or physics. For them, every sound had intention. Every storm was a message. And when they said the heavens were at war, they meant that creation itself was trying to remember how to hold together. In one fragment from the Lugali, sometimes called the Exploits of Ninurta, there's a strange line. It says, "The mountains rose up in rebellion against the Lord of the Air." The word for mountains there doesn't mean simple hills of stone. It means beings, sentient forces that refused order. In other words, nature itself was defying its creator, and it was Ninurta who answered that defiance. He was sent to bring the mountains low, to break the stones that refused to obey the pattern of heaven. This myth might sound distant, but its echoes are everywhere. Even now, every civilization tells its version of the same story, that the world once fell into chaos and someone or something brought it back. Maybe that's why these old myths linger, long after their languages have faded. They speak to something we all recognize, the fragile peace between creation and destruction, the endless rhythm of breaking and mending. When Ninurta took to battle, the tablets say the heavens grew dim. His father, Enlil, sent the storm winds to aid him. His mother, Ninlil, wept, for even gods could be wounded. And across the cosmic plane, the Asag, a being of disease and corruption, rose to meet him. The Asag wasn't simply a monster. It was the embodiment of imbalance, of decay overtaking life, of order unravelling. It was described as a stone that moves, a mountain that breathes fire, a sickness in the bones of the world. The battle between Ninurta and the Asag wasn't fought with weapons we'd recognise. It was fought through floods, through storms, through the shifting of the earth itself. The text describes rivers reversing their flow, mountains trembling, the very air thick with ash and dust. Whether those were metaphors for natural disasters or memories of real cataclysms, volcanoes, floods, or cosmic impacts, no one knows. But the emotional truth remains the same. The world was breaking, and someone had to hold it together. There's something haunting about those old lines. They say that when Ninurta finally struck down the Asag, the world exhaled. The waters calmed, the air cleared. But the victory came with silence, a silence that felt like mourning. The gods, for all their power, could not undo what had been lost. They could only rebuild. And that's where the myth shifts. Ninurta doesn't celebrate. He doesn't build monuments or demand praise. Instead, he turns to the mountains he destroyed and uses their remains to shape the new world. He takes the broken stones and turns them into boundaries for rivers. He redirects the floods into canals. He gives order back to the land. The warrior becomes a builder. The storm becomes the seed. There's an almost scientific rhythm to that transformation, as if the ancient storytellers were describing not just gods, but cycles of destruction giving birth to renewal, of energy reshaping matter. It's easy to forget that these stories come from some of the first people who ever mapped the stars, who tracked the movements of Venus, who understood the flood cycles of their rivers better than anyone else on Earth. Their myths were not superstition. They were observations wrapped in reverence. It's fascinating to think that when they wrote about the heavens at war, they might also have been describing real changes in the sky, comets, eclipses, or the shifting of constellations. To them, celestial conflict and earthly chaos were the same event, seen from two worlds at once. But what makes the story of Ninurta stand apart is the way it ends, or rather, how it doesn't. Because unlike many war myths, this one never truly concludes. There's no final peace, no everlasting calm. The struggle simply changes form. One age ends, another begins, and balance must be fought for again. It's easy to see why later generations forgot him. Ninurta wasn't a god of triumph. He was a god of maintenance, of quiet perseverance. The kind of strength that doesn't shine brightly, but endures quietly. Over time, that sort of story fades. People remember the conquerors, not the caretakers. Yet beneath the forgotten layers, his influence remained. When Babylon rose and reworked the old pantheon, Ninurta's essence merged with Marduk, another stormbringer who fought chaos and restored order. When Assyria built its empire, Ninurta became their warrior god, carved into stone reliefs with a bow and lion-headed eagles at his side. His name changed, his symbols evolved, but the pattern stayed. A divine protector standing between chaos and creation, keeping the fragile order of the world intact. If you close your eyes and let that image linger, it's not hard to feel a certain calm in it. A storm, yes, but one with purpose. A battle, yes, but one that ends in healing. The heavens, for all their violence, were also a place of renewal. Perhaps that's why even in sleep the mind drifts so easily to storms. Thunder in the distance, rain against the window, the rhythm of a world balancing itself again. Maybe somewhere, deep in the folds of our collective memory, we still remember the story of the warrior who fought not for victory but for restoration. As the night settles deeper and the edges of thought begin to soften, imagine those ancient skies once more. Vast, brilliant, crowded with moving lights. To the Sumerians, each one had a name, a meaning, a role in the cosmic order. They looked upward and saw the story of Ninurta written there, a tale of war, duty and healing, told not in words but in constellations. And so, as the heavens quieted after their war, the earth began to stir again. The rivers sought their paths, the winds carried seeds. The balance, though fragile, was restored for a time, and beneath those same stars that watched the storm, the people of Sumer began to rebuild, just as their god had done before them. The story of the heavens at war fades here, but its echo continues. Into the flood that would come, into the myths that followed, into the memory of a warrior who refused to let creation fall apart. And as the world settled into its new rhythm, somewhere in the silence, Ninurta's voice remained. Not loud, not triumphant, but steady, like the whisper of distant thunder, reminding the living that even chaos, when faced with care, can find its place again. The world after the great storm was quieter, but not yet peaceful. In the long shadow that followed the war of the heavens, the air still trembled with the memory of thunder. The rivers had found their courses again, though their banks were scarred. Mountains lay broken, where once they had dared to stand too high, and in the vast silence that followed, something new began to take shape. not just in the world of gods, but in the hearts of those who worshipped them. For the people of Sumer, it was a time of rebuilding. For the gods, it was the birth of balance. And at the centre of it all was Ninurta, the divine defender, born not in calm, but in the aftermath of chaos. To understand him, we have to step into that world, the one that existed long before cities, when the first temples were little more than raised mounds of earth. The people who lived there saw divinity in every sound. The wind was the voice of Enlil, the flood was the breath of Enki, the stars were the eyes of Anu. And when the first rumble of thunder echoed over the plains, they said it was Ninurta stirring, the young god of air and stone, waking from the silence his father had left behind. In the oldest hymns, Ninurta's birth isn't described like ours. There's no mother's cry, no gentle cradle, no time of innocence. He was born full of purpose. They said that when Enlil, the goddess of air and grain, gave birth to him, the mountains bowed, and the winds stilled to listen. The world for a moment stopped moving, as if to make room for something vast and untested. It was as though the elements themselves knew that balance had taken form again, not as law, but as life. The stories differ in small details, as myths often do, but they agree on one thing. Ninurta's first breath was not one of peace. He was born in motion, already reaching for the weapon that would one day define him. His voice, they said, was the sound of thunder travelling across water, his eyes like the lightning that splits night from night. In him lived both his father's strength and his mother's patience, though one would always struggle to temper the other. It's difficult not to feel a quiet admiration for those ancient storytellers, how they took the most violent parts of nature and found within them the soul of a protector. To them, Ninurta was proof that even the fiercest storm could serve a purpose, that destruction could be sacred if it restored what was broken. There's a passage, worn and fragmented, from a hymn found in Nippur. It says, "When the seed of the air was born, he grasped the winds in his hand. He spoke, and the rivers remembered their paths." Those words might sound poetic, but to the people who wrote them, they were more than metaphor, they were history. The gods, after all, were not distant abstractions. They were real forces alive in the world, and Ninurta, born of wind and will, was their link between heaven and earth. As he grew, the stories say, his purpose became clear. The other gods watched him carefully. Enlil saw in him a reflection of his own authority, but also something gentler, something more human. Enki, Lord of Wisdom, called him the strength that listens, and even Anu, the silent sky-father, looked upon him with rare approval. The world had many gods of might, but Ninurta was different. His strength existed not for conquest, but for repair. That distinction would define him for eternity. The early myths tell of his youth as a time of wandering. He walked the boundaries of heaven and earth, learning the songs of both. He moved through storms like they were doorways, listening to the language of thunder, the heartbeat of rain. Sometimes he sat in the quiet places between worlds, the mountains, the flood plains, the empty deserts, and waited for something to speak. Those who worshipped him said that was when the first tools were born. When Ninurta watched the patterns of water cutting through clay, he learned how to shape canals. When he watched wind scatter seeds, he understood how to cultivate life. This idea, that a god of war could also be a god of invention, feels unusual now, but for the Sumerians it made perfect sense. The world, to them, was a delicate balance of opposites. Every destroyer was also a maker. Every storm carried the promise of growth. And Ninurta, in all his duality, embodied that balance perfectly. Some tablets describe him as restless, eager to prove his worth. He trained under the guidance of his father, Enlil, mastering the winds and commanding the floods. His voice could summon tempests. His footsteps left furrows in the earth. But for all his power, there was uncertainty. The gods of that time lived in uneasy harmony, their alliances shifting like the tides. Each wanted dominion over some part of creation. The air, the water, the stars, All were territories in a divine map that was still being drawn, and somewhere between them all stood Ninurta, not sure yet whether his destiny was to serve, to fight, or to heal. It was said that he forged his bond with Sharur during those wandering years. The weapon was no ordinary creation. In some versions it was given to him by Enki, the god of wisdom, as both a tool and a teacher. In others, it emerged from the heavens themselves, a condensation of pure will shaped into sound. The tablets call it the talking mace, though that translation barely captures its strangeness. It could speak, yes, but it also advised, warned, remembered. In a sense, Sharur was not a weapon at all, but a companion, an intelligence bound to him. There's a haunting beauty in the way the myths describe their relationship. Sharur wasn't just something Ninurta used, it was something that guided him. When he hesitated, it reminded him of his purpose. When he grew angry, it tempered his judgment. It was both conscience and catalyst. And maybe, beneath all the divine imagery, that was the ancient way of explaining something very human, that even strength needs wisdom, and that power without reflection is just noise. As Ninurta learned the ways of the earth, he became known not just as a warrior, but as a guardian of fields, of harvests, of the steady rhythm between storm and sun. Farmers prayed to him before sowing their seeds, asking for rain that nourished, not rain that destroyed. Soldiers called upon his name before battle, hoping for courage that protected rather than conquered. But the peace of those years was fragile. The memory of the heavenly war still lingered. The other gods watched the earth grow fertile again and began to quarrel over its gifts. Some believed humankind owed them more than worship. Others saw in humans a reflection of their own flaws, creatures of both creation and chaos. When tensions rose once more among the divine, Ninurta found himself caught between loyalty to his father and compassion for the beings who walked beneath the clouds. It's in those moments of hesitation that his myth becomes most vivid. The tablets never paint him as flawless. He doubts, he questions, he learns. In one story, he unleashes a storm too soon and floods the plains. Horrified by the destruction, he spends days restoring the canals, drying the soil, guiding the waters back to their paths. The hymn that follows describes it beautifully. The storm god knelt in the mud of his own making, and the land forgave him. It's hard not to read that as something more than myth. There's humility in it, a sense of responsibility rare in divine tales. The warrior who causes destruction also repairs it. In that way, Ninurta's birth wasn't just the beginning of a life, it was the beginning of a principle, that true power is found not in domination, but in the courage to rebuild what one has broken. Even now, when archaeologists uncover tablets from those earlier cities, the name Ninurta appears beside symbols of rain, wind, and seed. Sometimes it's written alongside tools, hoes, ploughs, irrigation lines. He's there, quietly watching over the act of creation, not as a conqueror, but as a caretaker. Over time, his myth expanded. As cities grew, so did his image. In Lagash, he was worshipped as Ningasu, the local form of the same god. There they built temples to honour his victories over the monstrous forces of nature. One inscription describes a statue made of gold and lapis lazuli, showing him holding his weapon against a serpent-like creature. Another speaks of festivals held after the harvest, when offerings of grain were given to him, not because he demanded them, but because he symbolised the balance that made harvest possible. It's remarkable how, even as his divine status shifted, his essence remained. The stories of his battles always ended in renewal. The heavens might rage, but the outcome was life, and through it all, Ninurta's birth stood as the reminder that from the heart of every storm, something gentle could emerge. If you listen closely to the rhythm of these old myths, you start to hear something that feels almost like a heartbeat. A pulse that runs through all of them. The rise of chaos, the act of defence, the moment of calm after. It's the same rhythm that governs the world around us still. The flood, the regrowth, the renewal. Perhaps in telling stories of gods like Ninurta, the ancients were simply finding language for that pattern, a way to make sense of the cycles they saw every year, in every season. And yet, there's something deeply personal in these tales too. The idea that even the gods had to learn, that even power had to grow up. Ninurta wasn't born wise. He became wise through error, through observation, through compassion. That's what makes him more than a symbol. It makes him relatable. It's comforting in a way to think that the people of 4,000 years ago saw their gods as capable of learning. It meant that growth was divine, not just human. That even the mightiest needed patience. And patience, as they knew, was the first step toward peace. The lull that followed Ninurta's birth and his first lessons was brief. The balance he helped build would soon be tested again, in ways neither God nor man expected. But for that fleeting moment the world held its breath. The fields grew. The rivers ran clear. The heavens for once stayed still. And somewhere above it all, in a temple of light and wind, the young defender looked out across creation, not with pride, but with quiet resolve. He knew the calm would not last. It never did. But for now, that didn't matter. The task of protection wasn't about permanence, it was about presence. That was the gift Ninurta brought into being, not eternal peace, but the courage to preserve it for as long as possible. And in that act, the defender was truly born. The night softens around that image, the gentle hum of time passing, the slow rhythm of stories half remembered. Somewhere, beyond the walls of sleep, the old winds still whisper his name, not as a war cry, but as a lullaby from a world that once believed even storms could love. And as the stars turn quietly above the ruins of his temples, it feels almost possible to believe that they still remember him. The warrior born from the breath of the gods, the builder who tamed the flood, the one who fought chaos not for glory but for peace. They said it was not forged by hands, nor born of fire, nor shaped by any forge that man could ever build. It came, they whispered, from the sky itself, descending on a pillar of sound so deep that the ground trembled. They called it Sharur, the talking mace, the one that knows, the storm that listens. It was not a sword, not a spear, and not quite an object at all. To those who first told the stories, it was a living extension of will, an echo of divine thought turned into form, and it belonged to Ninurta. In the quiet light of myth, Sharur glows like a memory too powerful to fade. It is the weapon that defined the warrior, but it was also the voice that reminded him who he was. The old tablets never agree on when or how it came into his possession. Some say Enki, god of wisdom, crafted it as a gift to his nephew, an instrument of both guidance and defence. Others say the heavens themselves produced it in answer to chaos, as though the universe, weary of its own imbalance, shaped its own remedy. However it came to be, it was unlike anything else in the divine world. The people of Sumer, who feared storms as much as they revered them, spoke of Sharur with both awe and tenderness. It was not just a weapon that destroyed, it was a companion that spoke. When Ninurta was uncertain, Sharur offered counsel. When he raged, it calmed him. When he fell silent, it hummed softly in his hands, a reminder that even in stillness power waits. Imagine for a moment how it must have sounded in the imagination of those ancient storytellers. A low voice, resonant as thunder across the plains, speaking words that carried both command and compassion. To them, the gods did not simply wield power, they conversed with it. The mace that could think was not a fantasy. It was a symbol of awareness, a message that even force itself must have conscience. The legend says that Sharur could travel faster than light, that it could fly from Ninurta's hand and return again, carrying messages between heaven and earth. It was the first divine messenger, long before wings were given to angels or birds became symbols of flight. When Ninurta spoke to it, he wasn't giving orders. he was confiding. And when Sharur answered, its voice was said to ripple across creation, a sound heard not with ears but with the bones of the world. To the people who recorded these myths on wet clay, this was not strange. They already lived in a world where words shaped reality. To name something was to summon it. To describe the storm was to feel its presence. A talking weapon fit perfectly into that logic. It wasn't technology, it was truth made audible. There is a fragmentary tablet in which Sharur describes its own nature. The translation, rough but haunting, reads, "I am the word of the storm. I am the eye of the wind. I carry thought across heaven and strike where balance falters." For a moment, reading those words, it's easy to forget how ancient they are. The voice could belong to anything. An idea, a force of nature, or even the quiet inner voice that guides us when we stand between right and wrong. That's what makes myths like these so strangely timeless. They describe divine tools, but they are really describing human instincts, the conscience that tempers anger, the wisdom that speaks before the hand moves. When Ninurta first took up Sharur, the stories say the skies changed. The air shimmered with heat, and a deep sound rolled through the mountains. The other gods watched, wary. Power like that rarely arrived without cost, and Ninurta, still young then by divine standards, felt its weight. The weapon did not simply obey, it demanded purpose. Strike, it might have said, but know why. In those early days, Ninurta's mastery over Sharur was uneven. There are myths that describe his first battle, not against some monstrous foe, but against his own impatience. When storms broke too early, when floods came before the crops were ready, the people suffered and the gods murmured. Enlil, his father, scolded him not for the destruction itself, but for his lack of balance. Power, he reminded him, was not just about victory. It was about knowing when not to use it. That lesson would echo throughout Ninurta's life. In one tale, when chaos rose again in the form of the Asag, that being of sickness and stone, it was Sharur that guided him to victory. The text tells of a conversation between them before the battle. Sharur warns him of the Asag's strength, reminding him that to destroy it recklessly would risk unravelling creation itself. Ninurta listens. He does not rush. He waits for the right moment, studies the enemy, understands it, and only then acts. When the final strike comes, it is not born of rage, but of necessity. It's strange how that idea, written thousands of years ago, still feels so current. The notion that wisdom must guide strength, that even justice must pause to listen before it moves. Perhaps that's why the story of the talking weapon lingered so long in memory. It wasn't just about gods, it was about restraint, the quiet kind that makes all the difference between protection and destruction. The hymns go on to describe Sharur's power in ways that sound almost scientific. It could travel across vast distances in an instant, carrying messages between realms. It could strike from the heavens with precision so great that it left no chaos in its wake. It could, in the words of one fragment, separate truth from untruth like light divides darkness. Those descriptions don't feel like ordinary mythic exaggeration. They feel like awe trying to make sense of something real, perhaps a natural phenomenon, or perhaps simply the human ability to imagine perfection. For the Sumerians, every divine tool carried meaning beyond itself. The plough represented renewal. The temple symbolized order. Sharur represented the voice within power, the intelligence behind the act. When they prayed to Ninurta, they didn't just ask for victory, they asked for wisdom in how to wield it. Even in the archaeological record, the symbolism lingers. Reliefs from Assyria show gods and kings holding rods, discs, or sceptres that seem to float above their hands. Their edges glow with carved rays as if vibrating. They aren't just weapons, they are conduits, channels between heaven and earth. Scholars debate their meaning, but in the mythology, the idea is clear. Divine authority speaks, it does not shout. If you close your eyes, you can almost imagine it. The storm rolling over the plains, the faint pulse of thunder somewhere far away, and in that rhythm, the echo of a voice too deep to be language. Perhaps that's what Sharur really was, a symbol for communication between heaven and earth, between thought and action, a way for people to believe that the forces that terrified them also listened to them. There's something comforting in that, isn't there? The idea that the storm wasn't just random violence, but a kind of dialogue, that maybe, when the lightning flashed, it wasn't anger, but a message. When the rain fell, it wasn't punishment, but renewal. For the Sumerians, Ninurta and his weapon were the link between those meanings. His thunder wasn't destruction. It was conversation, the sky speaking to the soil. In later ages, when these myths were retold in Akkad, Babylon and Assyria, Sharur took on new forms. Sometimes it was a spear of light, sometimes a disk of energy, sometimes even a divine word spoken aloud. But the essence remained the same, the power that could strike, but chose to understand first. In that way, the myth of the talking weapon slowly evolved into something almost philosophical. It wasn't about violence at all. It was about responsibility. The weapon that speaks teaches the wielder to listen. It's worth remembering how radical that idea must have been in its time. These were societies surrounded by war, famine, and uncertainty. Power was survival. Yet here was a story that said power alone was not enough. That wisdom had to lead the way. The same story we tell now, in different words, in quieter ways, in classrooms, in families, in hearts that try to choose gentleness when anger comes too easily. And so, the image of Ninurta standing beneath the clouds, holding a weapon that hums with knowledge, isn't just an ancient fantasy. It's a reflection of something that still feels familiar, a reminder that strength, at its best, is thoughtful. One of the old hymns ends with a description that feels like a lullaby disguised as legend. It says, "When Ninurta raised Sharur, the earth turned its face to him. The mountains bowed, but the waters lifted their voices, and peace returned with the rain." You can almost hear that scene. The soft rumble in the distance, the scent of damp earth, the slow rhythm of drops on stone. The storm no longer frightening but reassuring. The weapon no longer a threat but a promise. It's easy, in the glow of that image, to see why people might have prayed to him before sleep. The same way we listen to the sound of rain now and feel safe. To them, Ninurta wasn't the noise in the thunder. He was the calm at its centre, the steady presence that said, "You are protected, you are watched, the storm will pass." And maybe that's what all of this really comes down to, the memory of protection, the reassurance that even in chaos there is awareness, there is purpose. As centuries passed, the stories of Ninurta and Sharur faded into other names and symbols, but their message, that intelligence and strength belong together, has never really gone away. It hums beneath every story of heroes who think before they fight, of builders who rebuild after destruction, of those who wield power with care. And so, when you next hear thunder rolling across the night, imagine for a moment that it isn't anger or warning or distance. Imagine it as a conversation, a sound that began before language, still travelling through time, the echo of a god and his companion, still reminding the world that even storms can be kind. As the night deepens and thoughts begin to blur softly around the edges, picture that ancient plain once more, the horizon wide and golden, the air thick with the smell of rain. A solitary figure stands there, half shadow, half light, his weapon resting quietly at his side. The storm hums, but it waits. And in that waiting, the world breathes. That was Sharur's gift. Not destruction, but patience. Not thunder for thunder's sake, but the understanding that even power must learn to listen before it speaks. And so, the talking weapon did not just change the fate of gods. It changed how people thought of strength itself. It made them believe that even the greatest forces could be gentle, that even the loudest storms carried wisdom within their roar. If you listen closely, perhaps you can still hear it, a low vibration in the distance, a pulse of air and memory, the voice of a weapon that once spoke to the wind, reminding it, gently, when to rest. And as the rain begins to fall in your own world, and your breathing slows to match the rhythm of those ancient storms, know that you are listening to the same song that lulled the first storytellers to sleep, the soft thunder of balance returning, the whisper of a warrior's conscience carried across the ages. The rains did not begin with thunder. They began with a quiet change in the air, a heaviness that made even the gods pause. The skies dimmed, the light bent differently, and a wind that smelled of salt and deep water began to move across the world. The people of Sumer had seen floods before. The rivers were life, and life always came with risk. But this time was different. This was not the familiar swelling of the Tigris or Euphrates after a good season. This was something larger, older, something that did not end at the horizon. In the tablets they call it the flood that remembered. It wasn't a punishment, not exactly. It was balance reclaiming itself, a reset written into the rhythm of creation. The world had become too heavy, too full of noise. The gods, weary of endless petitions, wars and pride, decided that silence was needed, a silence so vast that only water could make it. And yet not all agreed. Enlil, Ninurta's father, was said to have been the voice of the decision. He had watched humanity multiply and fight, build cities, and forget who gave them the soil to stand on. He saw in them chaos, the same chaos that once tore the heavens apart. To him, the flood was not cruelty, it was correction. The others hesitated. Enki, lord of wisdom and water, argued that to erase everything was to undo the purpose of creation itself. There were whispers of disobedience, of warnings given to a few, of boats built in secret. But the sky did not wait for consensus. When the flood began, it began everywhere. The first drops, they said, were not rain but tears, condensation of grief falling from the clouds. People looked up and did not understand what was coming. They saw the rivers rise and thought the storm would pass as it always did. But the rain did not stop. For days and nights without number, the heavens opened and the world sank. From the temples of Nippur to the low marshes near Eridu, everything dissolved. Walls melted into mud, crops vanished, the air itself filled with mist so thick that the sun disappeared. It must have been an endless grey, the kind of colour that hides both dawn and dusk. In that greyness, even sound was swallowed. The world became an echo chamber of falling water. It was said that Ninurta watched it happen from the threshold of the heavens. His father's command had been given, and though he was born of loyalty, his heart pulled in another direction. He looked down at the world he had helped to rebuild, the rivers he had tamed, the mountains he had carved into place, and saw it all unravelling under endless rain. He pleaded with Enlil, but the decision had already crossed from choice into law. Once the waters began, they could not be undone. The balance demanded cleansing, and no god could stop it. Still, Ninurta could not stand idle. The texts do not say exactly what he did. They are fragmented, missing whole lines where the story should be clear. But in the gaps, something shines through. A hymn found in the ruins of Girsu says simply, "He rose upon the storm that destroyed, and carried life upon his wings." Another fragment, older still, mentions a voice that guided the survivors through the mist. Whether that was myth or memory, no one can say. But the Sumerians believed that Ninurta did not fight the flood. He shaped it. When the deluge swept across the plains, the gods retreated to higher ground, to the mountain of heaven, as the tablets call it. From there, they watched the waters consume the earth. But Ninurta descended into the storm. He is described as the shield of life, moving through the flood like a beam of light through smoke. His weapon, Sharur, no longer thundered. It spoke softly, guiding him through the endless sea that had once been the world. He searched, the myths say, for anything that still lived. Seeds, animals, humans, it didn't matter. Whatever could carry life into the silence that would follow, he gathered it. Some stories merge his deeds with those of later heroes. The man called Ziusudra, or Utnapishtim, or Noah, depending on which version you read. But beneath all the names, the shape of the story remains. One being who preserves what the flood sought to erase. It's hard not to see something familiar in that story. Not divine vengeance, but divine grief. The flood was not simply destruction. It was sorrow in motion. The world had become too loud, too divided, too careless with its own gifts. The water was a return to stillness, a forced pause in the endless noise, and in that pause Ninurta became the last movement of compassion left. The flood myths from Mesopotamia are some of the oldest ever recorded. They predate the Hebrew texts, the Greek deluge of Deucalion, even the myths of faraway lands that speak of gods washing the world clean. In each, the theme is the same: renewal through loss, a recognition that creation must sometimes begin again. But in the Sumerian version, there's something especially gentle. The world doesn't end in fire or wrath. It ends in water, the element that nurtures as easily as it destroys. As the flood rose higher, Ninurta's role shifted. He was no longer the warrior. There were no enemies left to fight. Instead, he became a guide, a caretaker, a voice in the storm. The hymns call him the one who steers without oars, and the hand that holds the last flame. He becomes, in those verses, the quiet bridge between what was and what would be. You can imagine that moment, the endless horizon of water, the ruins of temples just below the surface, the faint shapes of trees half buried in the flood. The air heavy with rain that no longer feels like weather, but like eternity itself. And above it all, the sound of wings, steady and calm, carrying light through the gloom. There's a passage that has survived almost whole. It says, "He looked upon the waters and spoke to them. He said, 'Be still, for the seed yet lives.' And the waters, remembering his voice, obeyed." It's a small line, but it captures something profound, that even in their myths of destruction, the Sumerians believed in mercy. The flood may have been vast, but it was not endless. Even the storm had to rest. When the rain finally stopped, silence returned. Not peace exactly, and more like exhaustion. The water lingered, heavy and still. The air smelled of salt and clay. From the mountain of the gods, Enlil looked down and saw that the world was empty. He felt the weight of what he had done. And in that moment of divine regret, Ninurta returned, carrying with him fragments of what could be rebuilt. Seeds in a jar of clay, the memory of tools, the songs of wind and water. He placed them before the council of the gods, not as gifts, but as reminders. "The earth," he said, according to one lost line later restored from fragments, "does not forget its pattern. It will rise again." And it did. When the waters receded, they left behind fertile soil, black, rich, alive. The same soil that would later give rise to Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Eridu, the great cities of the Sumerians. The people who emerged after the flood did not remember the details. They only remembered the feeling, a world washed clean, a second beginning, and a god who had guided them through. That memory became ritual. Every spring, when the rivers swelled, they saw in the flood not destruction, but renewal. The temples of Ninurta were decorated with carvings of waves and boats, seeds and birds, symbols of survival and hope. The god who once roared in thunder was now invoked in prayers for calm waters and good harvests. It's remarkable how the story changes tone here. From chaos to care, from punishment to protection. The same flood that erased became the foundation for growth. It's almost as if the myth itself learned to breathe again, as if even the gods understood that silence was only beautiful if something followed it. In later hymns, they describe Ninurta walking through the new world after the flood, inspecting the land. The rivers now flowed differently. The mountains had changed shape. The constellations above had shifted. It was a new creation, one that bore the scars of what had come before. But he did not mourn the old world. He saw in it a chance to begin again, carefully this time. The poets wrote that he taught humanity how to read the earth once more, how to build canals that could hold the water, how to sow grain in the new soil, how to mark the seasons by the stars. The people who had survived, bewildered and humbled, followed his guidance. They built temples not in defiance of heaven, but in gratitude. Each offering of grain was not payment but thanks for the flood that ended and for the silence that taught them to listen again. And that silence in its way never truly left. It lingered in their rituals, their songs, their sense of time. Even now, when archaeologists unearth their cities, they find evidence of flood after flood, layer upon layer of silt marking centuries of renewal. History itself remembers the rhythm of the deluge. When the stories of the flood were retold in later ages, in Akkad, in Babylon, in the tablets of Gilgamesh, Ninurta's name often faded. The roles merged, rewritten under new gods and new tongues. But the pattern remained the same. There was always someone who refused to let the world end quietly. There was always a protector who walked through the water and gathered what could still live. Maybe that's why these stories still feel alive. Because beneath the divine names and mythic landscapes, they speak of something deeply human. The instinct to protect, to carry forward, to rebuild. The flood becomes a metaphor not just for destruction, but for every time we start over. It's a quiet thought, but perhaps that's what makes it comforting. The idea that even when everything seems lost, there's always something small that endures. A seed, a song, a story, and someone or something to carry it through the storm. As the floodwaters finally withdrew, leaving behind the promise of green, the world entered its silence. The air was still, the gods had retreated, and Ninurta, weary from what he had done, stood among the ruins. He had not disobeyed his father, not completely, but he had changed the outcome. The world would live again. It's said that he walked the plains for a long time, listening to the soft hiss of retreating water. Every step left prints that filled slowly with rain, reflections of the clouds above. He did not speak. There was no need. The silence itself was sacred, and perhaps that's the truest meaning of the story. Not the flood, but the quiet after. The stillness in which life begins again. The pause that allows the next breath, the next creation, the next dawn. The Sumerians called that stillness Ziud-Sud, the breath that follows the storm. They believed it was holy, a moment when the gods rested and the world dreamed. And in that dream, Ninurta's name was whispered, not as thunder, but as gratitude. So if the story of the flood begins with chaos and ends with calm, perhaps its real message is about renewal. That no matter how high the waters rise, there is always a voice somewhere reminding them when to fall. And maybe, when you listen to the sound of rain against your own window, soft, steady, patient, you can still hear the echo of that ancient promise, that even the greatest storms must give way to silence, that every flood, in the end, leaves behind something worth growing. The flood ended, but the world was never the same. It was quieter, humbler, a little more fragile, but it was alive, and in that fragile new world, the story of Ninurta was not forgotten. It was carried forward, through songs, through carvings, through the very soil itself, because the flood, for all its destruction, was not a conclusion. It was a beginning written in water, and Ninurta, the warrior who once spoke with thunder, had become the keeper of that beginning. As you rest now, imagine that calm after the storm, the vast silence, the scent of wet earth, the faint glimmer of stars returning to the sky, the world washed and waiting, ready once again to dream. And somewhere within that dream, a quiet voice still speaks, not of war, not of wrath, but of renewal. the voice of the one who carried life through the flood and taught the heavens how to be kind again. In the new world that followed the flood, everything was quieter. The rivers had settled, the air was gentle again, and the soil, black and soft, held the scent of renewal. Humanity, in its humbled state, began to rebuild. The first cities rose like cautious promises, made of brick and hope, of reed and river clay. They lit their fires carefully, as if afraid to disturb the gods who still might be listening. But even in that fragile peace, something uneasy lingered. The heavens had not forgotten what had happened, and the gods, though silent, were far from at rest. It is in that silence that the story darkens, for even among divine beings, peace is a fragile thing. The flood had cleansed the world of noise, but it had also left behind resentment. Some gods believed the destruction had gone too far, others thought it had not gone far enough. The world was balanced once more, yes, but balance can be a knife edge, and even the smallest breath can make it tilt. At the centre of that tension stood Ninurta. The flood had changed him. He was no longer the eager son of Enlil, nor the obedient warrior who followed without question. He had seen too much, done too much. He had felt the cost of divine decisions, the sorrow that came when orders turned into silence. His father, Enlil, ruled still with the authority of air and storm, distant and unbending. But between them a quiet fracture had formed. The tablets speak of it indirectly, as if those who wrote them were careful not to accuse. They describe the shadow that fell upon the council, and the storm that spoke softly but carried dissent. They tell of gods who began to question their purpose. Why create life if it must always be destroyed to restore order? Why build a world only to watch it tremble each time balance wavered? These were not mortal questions, they were divine doubts, and in the oldest myths, such doubts were dangerous. The Council of the Gods was said to meet in the Eka, the great mountain temple of Enlil. It was not built of stone, but of the elements themselves. Wind formed its walls, thunder its foundation, lightning its roof. There, beneath a sky that never slept, the gods gathered to decide the fate of the world. Ninurta stood among them, silent at first, listening. He could feel the weight of their power, the sharp edges of their pride. Enlil spoke first, declaring that the flood had been necessary, that the silence it left behind was proof of its success. The world was calm now, obedient, as it should be. Enki disagreed. He saw in the survivors a spark worth nurturing. He spoke of their resilience, their creativity, their ability to learn. He warned that destroying what grows is not balance. It is fear disguised as order. The debate turned, as it always did, into argument. The gods of storm, fire and judgment sided with Enlil. The gods of water, wisdom and healing stood with Enki. Between them, the air itself began to tremble. And there, caught between the voices of father and friend, stood Ninurta. The myth doesn't say how long he waited before speaking, only that when he finally did, the hall fell silent. He reminded them that the flood had not erased chaos, it had only hidden it. That even now, deep in the rivers and mountains, the remnants of the Asag's corruption still slept. He spoke not as a son or soldier, but as one who had walked the ruins of their decisions. He told them that order cannot exist without compassion, and that destruction without purpose breeds only more rebellion. It was a brave speech, and a dangerous one. To question the decrees of the gods was to question the hierarchy itself. Enlil's gaze, the texts say, grew cold. The winds in the echo began to stir. For a moment no one moved, and then, with a voice like distant thunder, Enlil declared that his son had forgotten his place. What followed is described not as battle, but as division. The heavens split into factions, those who believed in mercy and those who clung to control. The younger gods looked to Ninurta for leadership. The older ones whispered that he had grown too close to humankind, and thus began a conflict unlike the wars of the past. It was not fought with storms or floods, but with silence and distance. the slow breaking apart of trust among immortals. In the language of the tablets, that period is called the season of turning faces. The gods no longer met as one, they avoided each other's shrines. The rituals that once bound them together began to fade. Some stopped answering prayers altogether. The world below felt that withdrawal like a sudden winter. Crops failed without reason. Winds changed direction. Rivers flooded or dried unpredictably. The heavens were no longer united, and the earth reflected their disarray. For Ninurta, the dissonance became unbearable. He still loved his father, but he could no longer follow blindly. The stories say he left the Echo, walking alone across the skies, searching for a place untouched by divine rivalry. He found it, perhaps, in the southern mountains, a place called Kur, where stone and cloud met. There, he built a new dwelling, a sanctuary away from both heaven and earth. The humans who lived nearby said they sometimes saw strange lights there at night, flickering above the peaks like fire trapped in crystal. They said the storms that once frightened them now circled the mountains instead, as if guarding something precious. They built small shrines at the foothills, leaving offerings of grain and honey, whispering his name in gratitude for the calm that followed each tempest. But peace is rarely left alone for long. Enlil saw his son's withdrawal as defiance. To him, the order of heaven was not a matter of choice, it was duty. If one god stepped away, others might follow, and so he sent envoys, messengers of air and lightning, to demand Ninurta's return. The texts say they came with words, not weapons, but their message was sharp. The world cannot have two thrones, they said. Come back or be forgotten. Ninurta did not answer. Instead, he turned his gaze downward to the people who had begun to rebuild after the flood. He saw their small fires glowing in the dark, their fields sprouting again despite the ruin. He watched them learn, work, sing, and something in him softened. He realized that what the gods debated in temples, the humans lived every day. The struggle between chaos and order wasn't cosmic, it was personal. It was in every choice, every act of kindness, every refusal to give up. When Enlil's envoys returned to heaven empty-handed, the old god's patience ended. He declared his son's silence as rebellion and stripped him of his title as commander of storms. The winds no longer answered to Ninurta. The thunder that once sang his name went quiet. For a while, the skies were eerily still. Yet in that stillness, something new took root. The people who had once prayed to Enlil for rain began to pray to Ninurta instead. They built altars to him, not as a god of storms, but as a guardian of endurance. They said he understood the value of waiting, the patience of the seed beneath the soil. They began calling him by new names: Ningirsu, the lord of the plough; Ninib, the bringer of growth. The warrior who had once commanded tempest now became the symbol of quiet strength. It's a strange turn, isn't it? How easily power changes shape. The same thunder that once terrified became the sound of protection. The same god who once led armies became a teacher of farmers. The Sumerians didn't see contradiction in that. To them, transformation was divine. A god who could change was a god who understood life. Still, the divide in heaven deepened. Enlil, though proud, was not without feeling. There are lines in later hymns that suggest he regretted his anger. He watched from his temple as offerings to Ninurta grew, as people spoke his son's name with love rather than fear. And though he never admitted it, perhaps he saw that what Ninurta had done was not rebellion, but renewal. But for other gods, those whose power relied on obedience, Ninurta's independence was intolerable. They began to whisper among themselves. He has gone native, they said. He serves humans now, not the divine order. And in time, those whispers turned into action. The myths that follow are fragmented, but they tell of a conflict that stretched across the heavens, not a war of weapons, but of withdrawal. Temples that once shared blessings now hoarded them. Prayers went unanswered. The balance of the world began to falter again. Droughts followed floods. Peace followed famine. The people below felt the confusion but could not name it. To them, it was simply fate. And yet, even as the gods turned against their own, Ninurta remained steady. He tended his mountains, taught his people, and listened to the earth. The very storms his father had taken from him began to return, gently, like wayward children coming home. The wind would move through the valleys again, soft and measured. The rains would fall exactly when they were needed. Nature itself seemed to side with him, not out of defiance, but out of recognition. In one of the later hymns, Ninurta is described as the god who reconciles heaven and earth. It's a title born from this age, a time when the divine family fractured and one son tried to mend the cracks without violence. He didn't strike back at his father. He didn't curse his rivals. He simply continued his work, quietly restoring what the heavens had forgotten. There's a moment, near the end of the myth, when Enki visits him. The god of wisdom, weary from endless debates, comes to the mountain and finds Ninurta working alongside humans, helping them carve canals and raise walls against the floods. Enki watches for a while, then speaks. "You have done what the council could not. You have brought balance without decree." To that Ninurta answers simply, "Balance is not given, it is kept." Those words, if indeed they were ever written on clay, might be among the most human things ever attributed to a god. The idea that order is not something imposed from above, but something tended to, moment by moment. It isn't control, it's care. And maybe that's why, even as other gods faded into abstraction, Ninurta's memory endured in small ways, not through temples of gold or endless hymns, but through the steady rhythm of the seasons, the patience of those who plant and wait, the quiet faith that storms can be kind. It's easy to imagine that when the gods turned against their own, it wasn't truly a fall from grace. It was an evolution. A moment when even the divine learned that strength without empathy is hollow. And though the heavens would go on warring, reshaping themselves into new myths and new names, the story of Ninurta stayed gentle, steadfast, unshaken. Because in the end, it wasn't the power of thunder that made him divine. It was the silence he chose instead, the refusal to let anger speak louder than compassion. And as the night deepens and the world outside grows quiet once again, you might almost hear that same stillness in the air, the faint echo of an ancient calm, born from rebellion, but shaped into peace, the quiet understanding that even among gods kindness is the truest form of strength. And so the heavens, fractured but still watching, drifted into their long twilight, a time of reflection before the next creation, the next lesson, the next storm. Ninurta remained where the clouds touched the earth, neither above nor below, keeping balance the way only those who have seen it break can. The story doesn't end there, of course. Balance, once disturbed, never stays still for long. But for now, the sky holds its breath, the earth rests, and the mountains keep their quiet vigil. And in that calm, fragile, fleeting, but real, the forgotten warrior continues his watch, waiting for the next time the world will need him to rise. The quiet did not last. It never does, in stories of gods or in the lives of men. The stillness after the flood had stretched into centuries of rebuilding, of soft prayers whispered to rivers, of fields that rippled golden under gentle skies. Humanity had begun to believe for the first time in memory that peace might be the new rhythm of the world. But beneath that calm, something old was stirring. The mountains to the south, high, jagged, veiled in mist, had begun to tremble. At first it was subtle, a vibration beneath the soil, a shift in the sound of wind that swept through valleys. The shepherds who lived nearest to those peaks said they sometimes heard a low hum at night, deep and rhythmic, as though the earth itself was remembering a song it once forgot. The elders called it the breath of the mountains. The priests said it was a warning. But when the rumbling grew louder, When whole slopes began to collapse and rivers turned the colour of ash, the people turned their eyes to Ninurta once more. He had been silent for a long time, watching from his sanctuary in the southern lands between the realm of gods and the world of men. The temples dedicated to him were small but sincere, offerings of grain and small carvings, not gold or conquest. He had no need of grandeur. His power lay in patience. But when the earth began to shake, even patience had to move. The old stories call it the Second War of the Heavens, though it was fought not among stars but upon stone. The mountains of the south were said to have risen against their maker, the same living peaks that Ninurta had subdued long ago during his war with the Asag. It seems strange, doesn't it? That mountains could rebel, that stone could choose to move. But for the Sumerians, everything that existed had intention. Rock, river, wind, all were alive with purpose. And when they spoke of mountains defying the heavens, they meant that nature itself had begun to unbalance once again. The cause of this upheaval was unclear. Some tablets say the Asag had not truly been destroyed, only buried, its spirit sleeping in the deep caverns beneath the southern ranges. Others say that the floods had awakened new forces, creatures of fire and smoke that resented the calm world left behind. A few hymns hint that the gods themselves, divided after the council's fracture, had sent this chaos as a warning to Ninurta, a test of his new independence. Whatever the truth, the mountains began to burn. From his temple, Ninurta saw the smoke rising, dark plumes twisting into the heavens, heavy with the scent of sulphur and salt. The rivers he had once ordered into harmony now frothed and boiled. Fields vanished beneath creeping ash. The people fled northward, carrying with them the only thing they could: stories. They said the mountains had grown mouths, that they spat fire and sang in voices that were not human, and beneath it all, they said, was the beating of something vast and buried, the heartbeat of the Asag, waking again. For the first time since the flood, Ninurta called upon Sharur. The weapon, long silent, stirred like an old companion woken from sleep. The air around it trembled as though it recognized the call. The gods had turned against their own before, but now the world itself was turning too. Ninurta knew that balance, once broken, would not mend itself. When he descended into the southern lands, the sky followed him. The wind gathered around his steps, carrying with it the scent of rain and stone. The people who saw him that day described not a god of fury, but one of solemn purpose. His face was calm, almost sad. He did not come to conquer. He came to listen. The myth says that when Ninurta reached the edge of the burning range, Sharur spoke for the first time in many ages. The stones remember, it said, but memory can be cruel. Ninurta looked upon the mountains and saw in their rising forms the shape of his own past, the battles, the flood, the choices that had brought peace and pain in equal measure. He understood then that this was not merely a war of nature. It was a reckoning. The Asag's corruption, sleeping for ages, had taken root in the heart of the earth. It fed upon the resentment left by the gods' division, upon the fear of those who survived the flood, upon every shadow left unhealed. It was not one creature, but many, a swarm of energies, old as creation, bound by grief, and they had chosen the mountains as their refuge. The stories describe the first confrontation as something beyond the scale of the world. Ninurta called upon the waters, and they rose as walls of light. The Asag answered with fire from the earth, rivers of molten stone that cut through valleys like serpents. Thunder fell, but so did silence. It was not a single clash, but a long, slow struggle, one that unfolded through seasons, through the shifting of wind and weather. Each day, Ninurta descended deeper into the mountains. Each night the fires grew stronger. He struck not to destroy, but to reveal, to uncover the infection within the rock, to let the light reach the hidden veins of chaos that ran beneath the surface. Sharur sang as it struck, each blow echoing like a heartbeat through the valleys. The people who watched from afar said the sky itself seemed to pulse in time with it. And then, after many days, the storm broke. The Asag rose once more, not as a beast of flesh, but as a shadow made of light and smoke. It towered above the peaks, its form shifting, its voice 1,000 whispers. "You cannot end what began with creation," it said. "I am the hunger between order and rest. I am the space that even gods fear to fill." Ninurta did not answer in words. He lifted Sharur, and the weapon hummed low, steady like the breath before thunder. The ground cracked. The rivers surged backward, climbing their own beds. The sky folded in on itself, and for a moment the whole world seemed to hold its breath. The battle that followed is written in fragments, half poetry, half memory. The tablets say that lightning rained sideways, that fire and water merged into steam that blanketed the earth for 3 days. They say the stars vanished and the moon turned red. But through it all one sound endured, the measured rhythm of the talking weapon, guiding its bearer through the chaos. It was not an easy victory. The Asag, like all forces of imbalance, could not truly die. It could only disperse. When Ninurta finally struck the final blow, it did not explode or scream. It dissolved, its form unravelling into the wind, scattering across the sky like dust lit by firelight. And as it went, the mountains fell silent again. The fires dimmed. The rivers cooled. When it was over, Ninurta stood among the ruins, his weapon dim in his hands. The mountains that had rebelled now lay humbled, reshaped. Some say that the great ranges of the world, the Zagros, the Taurus, even the far Himalayas, were the scars of that war. Others say the story was never meant to describe geography at all, but the human heart, that same endless struggle between peace and chaos, creation and decay. Ninurta did not return to the heavens after that. He did not seek praise or counsel. He remained in the south, alone, walking among the stones. It's said that wherever his footsteps fell, new springs appeared, small trickles of water that became rivers, feeding the parched lands below. The people who returned to rebuild found their world richer, their soil more fertile than before. Out of the ruins of battle, life returned stronger. That was always Ninurta's way. Destruction was never his goal. Restoration always followed. There's a fragment from a hymn found near Lagash that captures that balance perfectly. It reads, "He broke the mountains, yet made the valleys bloom." That line, simple as it is, became one of the most repeated phrases in Mesopotamian prayers for centuries. Farmers carved it into the walls of their granaries. Priests whispered it during droughts. It was both comfort and instruction, that even in ruin there could be renewal. It's tempting from our modern view to see these stories as distant, as mythic poetry written by hands long turned to dust. But perhaps the people who told them weren't describing gods at all. Perhaps they were describing something universal, the cycles they saw around them every year, the flood that destroys and feeds, the storm that terrifies and restores, the battle that hurts and heals. Ninurta's war with the mountains might not have been an event. It might have been a truth. And maybe that's why his name survived in whispers, long after other gods faded into silence. Because his story wasn't about triumph, it was about endurance, the kind that never demands attention, but holds everything together quietly. As the centuries passed, the people of the south built new temples to him. They carved his image into clay tablets and stone reliefs, a figure standing between mountain and river, holding the weapon that glowed with inner light. In some carvings his eyes are closed, as if listening to something beyond sight. That was how they saw him, the god who heard the heartbeat of the world. When the priests recited his hymns, they did so slowly, their voices low, as though afraid to wake the earth. They called upon him not just for protection, but for understanding, for the wisdom to rebuild after loss, to forgive after anger, to balance after chaos. If you close your eyes now and listen closely, you might almost feel the echo of that story. the distant roll of thunder, not violent but soft, the hum of the ground beneath your feet, the air carrying the faint scent of rain over stone, the same sensations that shaped the first tellers of these myths. They looked around at their fragile world and saw divinity in the very act of balance. And perhaps that's why Ninurta's battle mattered so much. Because it wasn't about conquest or punishment. It was about harmony, the kind that has to be fought for again and again, each time the world forgets how to rest. When the gods turned against their own, Ninurta stood apart. When the earth turned against itself, he stood within it, always between, always in the middle ground, holding both sides of creation together by sheer will. They said that after the battle of the southern mountains, he climbed the highest peak and rested there. The wind wrapped around him like a cloak. The clouds gathered beneath his feet. For the first time in an age, he allowed himself to sleep. The people below said that when he slept, the storm stopped. The world, exhausted but whole again, followed his example. That's the kind of rest that myths are built on. Not the end of motion, but the pause between breaths. The peace that comes not from victory, but from understanding. And as night deepens, as your own world grows quieter, that same rhythm lingers, the steady hum of balance rediscovered, the whisper of distant thunder fading behind the hills. Somewhere far away, in the oldest corners of memory, the mountains of the south still stand in their silence, shaped by the hand of the forgotten warrior who once taught even the earth itself how to listen. And in that stillness, the story waits to begin again. The battle for the mountains had ended, but not in triumph. The fire was gone, the rivers had returned to their beds, and the air no longer shook with the hum of conflict. Yet, beneath the stillness, something restless remained. The land was healed, yes, but the hearts of the divine were not. The victory had cost more than anyone wished to admit. For every mountain that bowed again to balance, something within the heavens had cracked a little deeper. When the smoke cleared from the southern range, Ninurta stood among what was left. The peaks were scarred, their edges glassed from the heat of the battle. Streams of melted rock hardened into shapes that glimmered like black mirrors in the dawn light. The earth was quiet, but the silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, as though the world itself were holding its breath, waiting to see what came next. The people who lived in the valleys below emerged slowly, hesitant to believe the storm was truly over. They found the land changed beyond recognition. Where once had been fertile plains now stood new lakes and twisted stone. Yet, they also found streams of clear water trickling down from the ruined slopes, richer and purer than before. The destruction had left behind life, and though they did not understand why, they gave thanks. They whispered the name of Ninurta into the wind and lit fires of gratitude along the riverbanks. High above them, the god of storms turned guardian watched, exhausted but unmoved. He had not fought for praise. He had fought because the world had asked for balance, and he could not refuse it. But as the days passed, a strange unease began to settle over him. The quiet after battle was not the calm he expected. It was something else, something hollow. Sharur, his ever-faithful companion, sensed it too. The weapon, still faintly humming from the energy it had carried, spoke softly. The world is mended, but the heavens are not. Ninurta said nothing. He looked toward the distant horizon where the clouds gathered thickly, toward the direction of Nippur, where Enlil's great temple still stood. The council had not spoken since the battle began. No messages had come, no acknowledgement. It was as if, in choosing to act on his own, he had cut himself off completely. The old stories rarely say how gods feel, but here the lines blur. One fragment describes Ninurta wandering the ruined mountains, speaking to the stones themselves. "I have broken you," he said, "but in your breaking the world will live." It is a strange kind of prayer, not apology, not regret, but something in between, the recognition that sometimes salvation requires loss. That lesson was not easily accepted in heaven. When the messengers of the northern wind finally arrived, their words carried the sharpness of judgment. The council had declared that the battle in the south, though successful, was unauthorized. The energy released had shaken the balance of the skies. Stars had dimmed. The orbit of the moon, they claimed, had shifted slightly, a divine way of saying that even a righteous act could have consequences. Ninurta listened to the accusation quietly. He did not defend himself. He did not remind them that if he hadn't acted, the earth would have been lost to fire and ash. He simply turned away and began the long walk back down the mountainside. The messengers followed him for a time, repeating the decree, but he said nothing more. In that silence he accepted both the burden and the truth of what had been done. The myths call that time the season of separation. The gods, once close enough to speak across the wind, began to retreat into distance. They no longer gathered in one place. Their voices faded from the prayers of men. It was not anger that divided them. It was weariness, the kind that follows too many cycles of creation and destruction. Even immortals can grow tired of starting over. Ninurta withdrew deeper into the south, beyond the reach of the temples. The people there built him a new shrine, small and unadorned, near a river that glowed faintly in the moonlight. They called it the House of the Returning Storm. Each year, at the end of the rainy season, they left offerings of water and clay figures shaped like broken stones, symbols of both destruction and rebirth. They believed that their god was not gone but resting, waiting for the next time the world would need him. But even rest for a god who carries memory is never simple. One night, as the legends tell, the heavens stirred again. The stars flickered, dimmed, and rearranged themselves into new patterns. The air shimmered, and from the northern horizon came shapes of light. The fallen gods, those who had once stood beside Ninurta before choosing pride over patience. They had been cast down from their places, their light reduced, their forms changed. Some were no longer even recognizable. They came not to fight, but to plead. The myths speak of that meeting in hushed tones. The fallen arrived weary, their brilliance tarnished by centuries of silence. They asked Ninurta for forgiveness, not from him personally, but from the order he represented. They sought a return to purpose, a place again within the harmony of creation. But such restoration could not be given easily. Balance, once broken, does not rebuild with words. Ninurta listened as they spoke of exile, of wandering through void and shadow, of the loneliness that comes when even prayer no longer reaches you. He saw in their eyes not arrogance, but understanding, the kind of humility that only loss can teach. And perhaps in that moment he recognized something of himself in them. For he too had known exile, though of a different kind. The tale that follows is often called the forgiveness of the storm. It describes how Ninurta, moved by what he heard, chose not to punish, not to remind them of their failure, but to invite them into silence. He led them to the banks of the glowing river and told them to rest there. The water remembers, he said. It forgets only when asked kindly. For 7 nights the fallen gods sat by the river, their reflections shifting with the current. On the 8th night the sky above them changed. Faint stars flickered back into view, small lights reclaiming their place in the firmament. Whether that was mercy or simply time, the myths do not say. But the people of the south, who watched from below, saw the heavens brighten and knew that some measure of peace had been restored. Forgiveness, in the ancient Sumerian world, was never about forgetting. It was about returning to rhythm, the idea that even chaos once understood could find its place again. Ninurta embodied that idea more than any other. His compassion was quiet, but it had weight. It was not sentiment, it was structure, the scaffolding upon which the world could rebuild itself. The fallen gods, now forgiven, did not regain their former glory. They became part of the earth instead, guardians of rivers, mountains, winds. Their divine power sank into matter, shaping the natural world. And in that transformation, The Sumerians found their explanation for why every stone, every gust of wind, every spark of fire seemed alive. It was the residue of forgiveness, the echo of gods who had once fallen but were allowed to remain. There is a small hymn from that period that survives almost intact. It reads, "Those who fell became the breath of the earth. Those who were forgiven became its song." It's a simple line, but one that captures the heart of Ninurta's myth. Power that refuses forgiveness becomes destruction. Power that accepts it becomes creation. In later ages, priests would retell this story during times of drought or unrest. They would stand before their congregations and remind them that even the gods had quarrelled, had fallen, had been restored. That harmony is not perfection. It is persistence, the ability to keep returning, even when broken. And in that way, the myth of the fallen and forgiven became not just divine history, but a mirror for human life. The same pattern played out again and again. Empires rising and falling, kings learning mercy too late, civilizations forgetting and then remembering that balance is not conquest, it is cooperation. For Ninurta, the act of forgiveness did not erase his solitude. The heavens still felt distant. His father's voice remained absent, yet the burden grew lighter. The storm within him softened. The world below had begun to heal again, and that was enough. Sometimes the old hymns describe him walking along the riverbanks at dusk, listening to the sounds of insects and the rustle of reeds. In one, he kneels beside the water, places his hand on its surface, and watches the ripples move outward. Each ring, they say, carries a prayer, not to the gods, but from them. Small circles of calm expanding forever into the unknown. It's easy to see why the people loved him most in this form, not as the roaring warrior or the stormbringer, but as the quiet protector who learned to forgive what even the heavens could not. His divinity was no longer distant. It was close, human in its rhythm, steady in its compassion. If you think about it, maybe that's what all forgiveness really is. The return to rhythm. The slow, careful rebuilding of what once fell apart. It doesn't erase the past. It reshapes it into something that can live again. And so, as the night stretches long and the world around you softens into its own silence, imagine that river, wide, calm, reflecting a sky scattered with returning stars. The fallen have found their place. The storm has found its rest. The earth breathes evenly again. Above it all, Ninurta watches, not as ruler, not as redeemer, but as witness. He knows the balance will break again someday. It always does. But for now, the world is whole, and that, he understands, is enough. The whisper of water continues, steady and timeless. The air carries the faint hum of peace rediscovered. And somewhere beyond hearing, the forgotten warrior closes his eyes, allowing the sound of the river to carry him too into quiet. Because even gods need rest, even storms need sleep, and even the fallen, once forgiven, become part of the calm that holds everything together. The river had grown wide by then, winding through the new world like a long memory that refused to fade. The people of the south had learned to live with its moods, its floods and its silences, its silver mornings and its nights thick with fog. They had learned too that gods could change, that storms could learn patience, that even silence had a heartbeat if one listened long enough. For Ninurta, those quiet years should have been peace. The world below him was healing. The people, grateful for his mercy, had built small temples filled with song instead of sacrifice. The mountains that once burned now bloomed with wildflowers, growing from soil still warm from ancient fire. Yet something restless lingered in the air. It was faint, almost invisible, a sense that the heavens were watching again. The old order had not forgotten. Far to the north, in the city of Nippur, Enlil's great temple still cast its shadow across the plain. The Ekur, the mountain house, was not made of rock but of air, storm, and the hum of divine energy that few could withstand for long. Inside it, upon a dais of polished stone, rested what the ancient tablets called the Tablets of Destiny. They were said to be the heart of divine law, the map of existence itself. On them were written the names of all things, the measure of time, the order of heaven and earth. Whoever possessed them, the myth said, held the power to command reality. To speak with them was to shape the world. For as long as anyone remembered, the tablets belonged to Enlil. He guarded them not as treasure but as burden. His was the authority to maintain order, to decree, to divide, to assign fates. And yet, even he was not immune to doubt. The flood had scarred him. His son's defiance had wounded his pride. The war among the gods had left his once clear rule clouded with hesitation. The tablets, though still his, had grown heavy. There were whispers in the heavens that the inscriptions had begun to shift, that lines once carved in divine clarity now blurred, that the stars no longer followed their precise paths, that creation itself was slowly rewriting its own script. Enlil, who had built his very being on certainty, could not bear that uncertainty. He blamed no one aloud, but in the silence between winds, his thoughts turned southward, toward the sun who had chosen compassion over command. The shadow that fell upon Enlil was not darkness in the mortal sense, it was doubt, the kind that comes quietly, unseen, yet moves through every decision like a whisper. To a god of order, doubt is poison. And yet it had come. In the myths that survived, this is the moment when the balance begins to shift again. Ninurta, content in his exile, unaware that the great tablets of destiny had begun to waver, continued his quiet guardianship. He spoke to the rivers, tended the mountains, and taught humankind the ways of the plough and the calendar. To them, he was no longer a god of war. He was the keeper of cycles, the one who understood time's rhythm, but in heaven time was beginning to unravel. One night, as Ninurta sat by the glowing river, the same place where he had once forgiven the fallen, Sharur stirred. Its voice, usually soft and rhythmic, now trembled. "The winds are confused," it said. "The laws of the sky are being rewritten." Ninurta raised his eyes to the stars. At first he saw nothing unusual. The constellations shimmered as they always did. But then he noticed a strange drift, stars moving where none should move, a faint ripple in the fabric of night. It was subtle, but to him, who had seen the heavens change before, it was unmistakable. The order of creation was shifting again. The old hymns describe what happened next in language that sounds more like memory than myth. They say Ninurta closed his eyes, reached out not with his hands but with his mind, and followed the disturbance back to its source. What he found was the shadow of his father, Enlil, alone in the echo, clutching the tablets of destiny, as if holding the universe itself together by force of will. The inscriptions, glowing with divine fire, flickered between brightness and darkness. The texts hint that the power within them had begun to resist him. The laws they carried were alive, self-sustaining, and Enlil's doubt had made them restless. The order of things, day and night, creation and decay, cause and consequence, had begun to slip beyond command. Ninurta did not rush to intervene. He waited, hoping the balance would restore itself, that the heavens would find calm again. But the change deepened. The winds grew erratic. The moon faltered in its cycle. The waters below began to rise without rain. The pattern that held the world together was unravelling, and Ninurta knew that if it continued, no god, no human, no creature would escape the collapse. So he left his sanctuary and returned north. The journey is described with a kind of reverence in the surviving texts. They say that as Ninurta walked, the air bent around him, forming corridors of wind and light. The clouds parted, not from fear, but from recognition. Even the stars dimmed as he passed, bowing to the one who had once fought for their order. When he reached Nippur, the city was silent. The great ziggurat, once thrumming with prayers, stood dark against the horizon. Inside the Ekur the priests had fled. Only the echo of storms remained. Enlil was there, seated before the tablets, his hands resting on their surface, his face pale with strain. The inscriptions pulsed, words shifting and twisting, forming new paths, new destinies. "It no longer obeys," he said without looking up. "The world moves of its own accord." Ninurta stepped forward quietly. "Then let it move," he said. "The river does not obey the mountain, but both find their way to the sea." But Enlil was not ready to hear it. For all his power, he was afraid, not of losing control, but of losing meaning. He had defined himself through order. Without it, who was he? The two stood there, father and son, storm and silence, with the tablets between them. The myths call this moment the meeting of shadows. No thunder shook the sky, no wind tore through the temple, only stillness, heavy and expectant. Ninurta reached out his hand, not to take the tablets, but to steady them. As his fingers brushed their surface, the flickering slowed. The inscriptions glowed steady again, the light even and calm. The change was immediate. The winds outside quieted, the moon steadied, the pulse of the world found its rhythm. Enlil looked up. "You would take them from me?" he asked, his voice low, not angry but wounded. Ninurta shook his head. "No one can hold them forever, not even you. They belong to what is, not to who we are." The myth ends differently in different versions. Some say Enlil, humbled, handed the tablets to his son, acknowledging that compassion, not command, was now the true measure of power. Others say Ninurta never touched them again, only restored their balance and left them where they belonged, choosing to return to the earth rather than claim the heavens. But in all tellings, what follows is the same. The light of the tablets dimmed to a steady glow, and the world exhaled. The Sumerians may not have seen this story as literal, but as reflection. They lived in a world of patterns, flood and drought, chaos and calm, and they understood that every kind of order must eventually question itself. The gods were not perfect beings. They were mirrors of the cycles they ruled. After the meeting of shadows, the bond between Enlil and Ninurta was never the same. It wasn't hatred that separated them, but understanding. Each had seen the truth the other feared. Enlil had learned that control could become blindness. Ninurta had learned that even compassion has limits. The world could not exist without both. In time, Enlil withdrew further into the heavens. His name would continue in prayers and rituals, but his voice grew distant. The order he built would survive in laws, in tradition, in the very structure of how humans organized their lives. But it was Ninurta's balance, his quiet living understanding, that shaped the rhythms of the earth. The tablets of destiny, though still guarded in myth, came to symbolize something simpler. The unseen order within everything, the pulse behind seasons, the movement of tides, the mathematics of time. To the priests who studied them, they were not objects but metaphors. The belief that knowledge and humility must always walk together. In some later hymns, the story of the shadow becomes almost tender. It tells of Enlil, old and tired, watching the sunrise and whispering to the wind, "The world no longer needs my voice, it has learned to listen on its own." And somewhere far to the south, Ninurta feels the wind carry those words and bows his head in silent respect. There's something quietly human in that ending, a father who cannot let go, a son who learns when to, a world that grows not by command but by trust. If you think about it, the tablets of destiny were never about control. They were about connection, the threads that tie one choice to another, one life to the next. They remind us that even in myth, fate isn't written in stone. It breathes, it adapts, it forgives. The Sumerians, those first dreamers of civilization, seemed to know this. Their gods were powerful, but their stories were patient. Every act of creation was followed by reflection. Every storm was followed by rebuilding. It's a rhythm that still exists quietly in the way time itself moves, forward yet circling back. So, as the story drifts once more into silence, imagine the image that ends this part of the myth. A great temple filled with still air, a father and son standing in the glow of sacred tablets, their shadows merging on the stone floor. The air no longer trembles, the writing no longer shifts. The world for a moment understands itself again. Outside, dawn breaks over the plains of Sumer. The first light of morning falls across the rivers, the reeds, the small villages just beginning to stir. The same light that once shone on gods now touches human faces, and in that gentle passing of radiance the balance continues. Quiet, invisible, alive. And somewhere between the rising sun and the fading stars a whisper remains, carried on the wind that has never stopped moving. The voice of Ninurta, calm and steady, reminding the heavens and the earth alike that destiny was never something to own, only something to understand. And so the story goes on, carried forward not in thunder, but in memory. The tablets still glow somewhere, unseen. The world still writes itself, line by line, heartbeat by heartbeat, and in the rhythm of that endless writing, everything finds its place again. The storm had passed long ago, but its echo still lived in the quiet corners of the earth. The skies no longer roared. The rivers, once swollen and fierce, now moved with a patient rhythm, tracing new paths through the plains. The people who survived the great upheavals of heaven and earth began to understand something that even the gods had struggled to grasp. That peace, true peace, was not a gift. It was a construction, one that needed hands, memory, and time. In the years that followed the return of balance, the world seemed to breathe again. Crops grew thick and golden along the riverbanks. The rains came when they were needed, not too soon, not too late. Nights were cool, mornings warm, and for the first time in what must have felt like eternity, there was a sense of trust in the air. The heavens, it seemed, were content to watch rather than rule. The gods had grown quiet, their wars and councils distant memories whispered about in temple songs, and somewhere among them Ninurta watched too, not as a commander, not as a son, but as a guardian. He walked the new world slowly, like a farmer inspecting his fields after a long season. He saw what had endured, what had changed, and what had been lost. Where once the mountains had glowed with fire, now they were covered in green. Where the flood had carved deep scars in the land, people had built canals to guide the water. Where once there had been chaos, now there was rhythm. But rebuilding, even for gods, is never simple. The world, though calm on its surface, carried within it the memory of its pain. The floods, the wars, the silence. They had left marks not just in the earth, but in the hearts of those who lived upon it. People feared the sky now. They looked at thunder and thought of anger. They saw lightning and remembered loss. They prayed to Ninurta not only for rain, but for restraint, that the heavens might continue to hold their temper. Ninurta understood. He had been the storm once. He knew what it was to be misunderstood by the world he tried to protect. And so he chose to rebuild not through power, but through presence. He walked among the people in quiet forms, sometimes as a traveller, sometimes as a craftsman, sometimes as the wind itself, carrying a whisper of calm across the fields. The myths from this age are softer. The songs no longer speak of thunder and war, but of teaching and patience. They tell of a god who taught humankind how to measure time by the shadow of the sun, how to store grain for the lean seasons, how to read the signs of the sky without fear. They call him the restorer, the keeper of the boundary, the one who knows when enough is enough. In the ruins of an ancient temple dedicated to him, a place now barely a mound of baked clay and broken brick, archaeologists once found a small inscription carved into a foundation stone. It reads, "He who knows the weight of water knows the weight of mercy." It's a simple line, but it carries the heart of everything Ninurta had become. To rebuild the world after a storm, one must understand both destruction and restraint. The Sumerians, who told these stories, must have understood how fragile the balance of their world was. Each year the rivers could bless or destroy. Each harvest could save or starve. Their gods, in many ways, reflected those uncertainties. They weren't distant creators, perfect and unchanging. They were companions in struggle, flawed, learning, capable of error and redemption. And among them, Ninurta stood as the reminder that even the fiercest storms could choose gentleness when needed. The rebuilding of the world began with water. It always does. The rivers, having carved new paths, now had to be tamed once more. Ninurta guided the people in shaping them, teaching them to dig canals that followed the natural flow rather than fighting it. They learned to listen to the land before cutting into it, to understand the way water wanted to move. "Do not command the river," one old hymn quotes him as saying. "Walk beside it, and it will take you where you need to go." Those words became the basis of an entire philosophy, one that would echo across centuries of civilization. Cooperation, not conquest. Observation before action. Patience before force. These were not the lessons of war, but of renewal. As the cities grew again, so did the temples. But they were different now. The grand ziggurats of the early gods, towering monuments of competition, gave way to smaller shrines built of simple clay. They were designed not to reach the heavens, but to harmonize with the horizon. The people no longer sought to climb toward the gods, they sought to meet them halfway. It was during this age, the myths say, that the knowledge of writing and measurement spread more widely among humankind. The act of carving symbols into clay became sacred, a way to preserve memory, to give shape to time itself. Some of the first tablets dedicated to Ninurta from this era contain not hymns of praise, but lists of irrigation schedules, seed types, and star positions. To the people, this was devotion. To understand the world was to honour its guardian. And yet, even as humankind grew wiser, the gods continued to fade. The more the people learned, the less they needed intervention. That was perhaps the truest success of all. The rebuilding was not only of cities and fields, but of trust. Trust in the world's own rhythm, in the ability of life to sustain itself without divine interference. Ninurta watched this unfold with quiet pride. He had fought for balance. Now, he saw it living. There are a few surviving hymns from this time that feel almost like goodnight songs, gentle, slow, filled with gratitude. One, known as the Song of the Rebuilt Earth, says, "The flood is gone, the storm asleep, the plough sings where thunder was. We build not towers, but tomorrow." It's difficult not to feel something deeply peaceful in those lines. The idea that creation continues not through spectacle, but through daily care. That rebuilding isn't an act of power, but of attention. And yet, for all the calm, Ninurta knew that balance was never permanent. The heavens still watched, and the lessons of one age could easily be forgotten in the next. That is the quiet melancholy woven through these myths, the understanding that even gods cannot make peace eternal. They can only teach others how to tend it for as long as possible. In the later retellings, Ninurta's presence becomes more symbolic. He appears not as a person, but as natural phenomena, the first breeze after rain, the sound of thunder rolling away instead of toward, the glint of sunlight on wet soil. He had become less a figure and more a feeling, the reassurance that the worst had passed and that life could begin again. Perhaps that is the truest form of divinity, to step back once the lesson is learned, to become invisible, yet remain everywhere. The people continued to honour him quietly. At the start of each planting season, farmers would leave a bowl of clear water on the edge of their fields, saying, "For the one who listens to storms." It was not prayer in the traditional sense. It was gratitude, a small human gesture to the memory of balance. The rebuilding of the world after the storm wasn't just physical, it was emotional. The stories told around the fire began to change. Where once they spoke of gods in conflict, they now spoke of cooperation. Where once fear shaped devotion, now hope did. Children grew up hearing about a god who had forgiven his enemies, who had spoken kindly to fallen beings, who had taught that strength without gentleness was hollow. It's possible that this shift in storytelling changed the people themselves. Over generations, they built systems of law that emphasized fairness. They developed forms of trade and diplomacy that valued agreement over domination. Civilization, in many ways, became a reflection of the divine reconciliation that had once occurred between Enlil and Ninurta. Order and compassion learning to coexist, and yet in every piece there is always a shadow, the memory of the storm that made it necessary. The myths do not shy away from this. They say that even as Ninurta watched the world flourish, he sometimes felt the faint rumble of thunder in his chest, like an old heartbeat he could not quite forget. Not out of longing for war, but as a reminder. Every balance exists because something once threatened it. Every calm carries the echo of chaos that came before. It is in that awareness that wisdom lives, not in denial of what was, but in gratitude that it is no longer. The Sumerians had a word for this kind of peace, shul. It didn't mean stillness, it meant harmony through awareness. The kind of calm that remains alert, ready to act when needed but content to rest when not. That, they believed, was Ninurta's final gift to the world. Not the end of storms, but the understanding of when to let them pass. There's a quiet beauty in imagining him in that state, standing on the edge of a field at dusk, watching as the light fades across the water, feeling the hum of the earth beneath his feet. The air is soft, the clouds drift lazily. Somewhere, a farmer finishes his work and looks up at the sky, smiling at the thought that perhaps the old god still watches, still approves. Time moves differently in myths. Years become moments, and moments become ages. Eventually, even the memory of the storm becomes story, then symbol, then silence. But the lessons remain, written not on tablets or temples, but in the way people live, in every canal that follows the natural curve of the river, in every community that chooses rebuilding over revenge, in every act of care after loss. That is the legacy of the rebuilding. Not the return to what was, but the creation of something wiser, softer, more enduring. The gods had learned their lessons, the people had learned theirs, and the world, at least for a time, remembered what balance truly meant. If you listen now, in the quiet of night, you might hear something faint in the distance. The sigh of wind through old reeds, the gentle trickle of water over stone. It's the same sound the Sumerians heard when they told these stories, the same sound that once filled the air after the flood. The sound of a world breathing again, and perhaps, if the air is still enough, that sound carries something else too. A whisper from long ago, the voice of the storm that chose peace. It doesn't speak loudly, it doesn't command, it simply reminds. Everything broken can be rebuilt, and everything rebuilt must be cared for. And as the night deepens and the stars steady themselves above, the world feels balanced again, quiet, alive, waiting. Because rebuilding, like life itself, never really ends, it just changes form. And somewhere, in the hush between wind and water, Ninurta still keeps watch, ensuring that what was once torn apart continues gently to hold. Time, to those who lived in the shadow of the first cities, did not move the way it does for us. It drifted like wind over sand, reshaping the surface but leaving the deeper layers intact. Centuries passed, and yet, in the clay and the stone, traces of the old world remained. The people who rebuilt after the great storms and floods began to forget the details of what had happened, but they never forgot the feeling, the awe, the fear, the gratitude towards something vast that had once walked beside them. And so, they began to build. Not just homes or walls, but memories made solid. Temples rose once more from the earth, not in defiance of the heavens this time, but in harmony with them. Their walls leaned slightly inward, as if bowing. Their steps ascended not to command the sky, but to meet it halfway. Among these new sanctuaries, one name appeared again and again, etched carefully into the bricks: Ninurta. By then, he was no longer remembered as the son of Enlil, or even as the wielder of storms. He had become something quieter, more enduring. The god who rebuilt, who taught, who remembered. His temples were scattered like seeds across the plains of Sumer and beyond, each one a variation of the same story carved in stone and sung in slow, low voices. In Lagash they built him a temple of baked clay, its surface smoothed by hands that had carried water and grain rather than weapons. In Nippur a smaller shrine was added beside the great temple of Enlil, not as a rival, but as a complement. Even the priests of the air god had learned by then that order alone could not hold the world together. Compassion needed its place beside command. The hymns carved on the walls of these sanctuaries are some of the oldest known to humankind. They do not glorify conquest. They do not recount battles. They speak of balance, of the weight of rain, of the patience of the seed. In one, Ninurta is called the one who restores what has been scattered. In another, he is the hand that steadies the plough. These were not the titles of a warrior in the old sense. They were the names of a god who had learned to turn strength inward, to shape instead of shatter. The builders of those temples worked slowly. They had learned from their ancestors that permanence was an illusion. Floods would come again, winds would shift, empires would rise and fall. But what mattered was the rhythm, the act of building, of maintaining, of remembering through creation. Each brick carried a prayer, each column a story. And as they worked, they whispered his name into the dust, ensuring that it would mix with the mortar and live within the walls. To walk among those ruins now, or what remains of them, is to feel a kind of echo, a soft hum beneath the noise of time. The air still holds a trace of devotion, as if the stones themselves are still speaking. Archaeologists sometimes describe this as atmosphere. The Sumerians would have called it spirit. They believed every object retained memory, that even clay could remember the hand that shaped it, the voice that blessed it, the god it honoured. And so, when they built for Ninurta, they built with gentleness. The temples were not meant to impress the eye, but to steady the heart. The most famous of these sanctuaries was the Temple of Girsu, known in the old tongue as Ininnu, House of the 50 Powers. It was said to be a place where heaven and earth met without conflict. The priests there tended a garden fed by canals that mimic the veins of the world. Each plant, each stone, each flowing line of water was symbolic of the order Ninurta had restored. The temple's outer walls were decorated with carvings of rivers merging, of mountains bowing, of storms dissolving into rain. One inscription from Girsu, written in elegant Sumerian cuneiform, reads, "He calmed the storm, he divided the waters, he set the plough in the hands of men, he gave the wind its purpose." It is remarkable how human that sounds, as though they were not describing a distant deity, but a teacher, a friend. The priests of Ninurta were known not for their rituals, but for their understanding. They studied astronomy, agriculture, medicine, and engineering. They were the keepers of balance in practical form, those who ensured that temples aligned with stars, canals followed gravity, and the measurements of bricks followed proportion. To them, faith was not separation from the world, it was precision within it. That may be why Ninurta's name appears not only in hymns but in administrative records, calendars, and early scientific texts. He became the embodiment of right measure, of cause and consequence, of knowing when to act and when to wait. The same god who once commanded the storm had become the spirit of balance in everything from the irrigation of fields to the flow of trade. In the myths, the transformation was gradual. The warrior did not vanish. He evolved. The memory of his battles, The war with the Asag, the flood, the clash with his father were retold not as history but as metaphor. They became lessons. The Asag was no longer a monster of stone and fire, but the chaos that lives within every decision. The flood was not wrath, but renewal. Enlil's shadow became the weight of pride, and Ninurta's patience, its cure. It's easy to see how such stories could survive, even as kingdoms fell and new gods rose. They were not about dominance. They were about endurance, and endurance quietly outlasts everything. In later ages, as the Akkadian and Babylonian cultures grew from the roots of Sumer, Ninurta's name changed slightly. Ningirsu in one region, Ninib in another. But his essence remained. He was still the god of the boundary, the mediator between destruction and growth. His temples became centers of knowledge. His priests became scribes and record keepers. Even when his mythology was overshadowed by younger, louder gods, his influence lingered in the way they spoke about wisdom, patience, and restoration. There's a kind of beauty in that fading, a quiet dignity in being remembered not for conquest, but for care. His image softened through time. The fierce warrior of early carvings with wings spread and weapon raised was gradually replaced by depictions of a calm figure holding a plough or a stylus, symbols of creation rather than destruction. The people no longer feared his storms. They sought his guidance in times of rebuilding, after floods, after war, after loss. His temples became sanctuaries for those who wished to start again. It's said that in one of his shrines during the reign of a later king, there was a room filled with broken statues, fragments of gods and heroes from older eras. Instead of discarding them, the priests had gathered them there, arranging the pieces carefully on shelves. They called it the Hall of Fragments. Each broken figure was a reminder that even divine things could fall apart, and that reverence, like the world itself, was built from repair. That, perhaps, is the truest reflection of Ninurta's spirit. The god of rebuilding had inspired a culture of preservation. Even ruins were seen as sacred. Even cracks were reminders of care. If you close your eyes now and imagine walking through one of those temples, you can almost hear what they must have heard. The low hum of wind moving through narrow corridors, the faint dripping of water into stone basins, the sound of reed mats shifting under the feet of priests as they carried offerings of grain and honey. There would have been no shouting, no grand ceremony, only rhythm, the sound of a world that had learned to breathe again. In the cool shade of those walls, people found comfort. They brought their burdens, not to be absolved, but to be understood. Farmers came to thank the rain. Merchants came to ask for fairness. Mothers came to bless their children with calm hearts. And in the centre of it all, the statue of Ninurta stood, serene, watchful, its face carved with a kind of gentle strength. The hymns say that when the wind moved through the temple's openings, it made a soft tone, a sound like distant thunder smoothed into melody. The people believed it was the god's breath, a sign that he still lingered, listening. And maybe he did. Because even when centuries later those temples fell into ruin, even when new empires replaced the old, the memory of that sound endured. The echo of calm after chaos, the hum of stone remembering compassion. Archaeologists who uncover the remnants of those sites today often describe a strange quiet that settles over them while they work, as if the dust itself were watching. They find fragments of inscriptions, bits of pottery, carvings of rivers and stars, and though they translate the words into modern tongues, the feeling is always the same: balance, restoration, continuity. It is a kind of immortality that no god could plan, to live not through fear but through peace. And perhaps that is why, even as Ninurta's name faded from common speech, his presence remained hidden within the architecture of time itself. In every act of rebuilding, in every human effort to restore what was lost, a small echo of him persists. The temples may be gone, but their purpose, their rhythm, continues in us. Because to rebuild, to remember, to find harmony after ruin, that is the truest prayer. And the stones, even now, still whisper it. They whisper it in the sound of footsteps across ancient courtyards. They whisper it in the rustle of wind over old ziggurats. They whisper it in the hush that falls when we stand before ruins and feel, somehow, that we are not alone. Perhaps that's what the Sumerians meant all along when they spoke of living gods. Not beings who commanded from above, but presences that lived within the things we continue to build, mend, and understand. Ninurta, the forgotten warrior who once saved the world, became one of them, not through battle, but through endurance. He became the echo that teaches patience, the memory that holds the lesson of storms. And as the night settles again around you, soft and familiar, think of that echo, not as something distant, but as something near, the steady rhythm of your own breath, the gentle pulse of life continuing in quiet defiance of all that ever tried to end it. That, too, is an echo in stone, the oldest, simplest one of all, the sound of a world still choosing to rebuild. There is a quiet moment in every story, a point when the voice that once guided it begins to fade, not because it has been silenced, but because it has completed its work. For the people of Sumer, that fading came softly, like the dimming of evening light over their temples and fields. The names of gods that had once been carved freshly into clay were slowly rewritten, reshaped by new tongues, new rulers, new cities. The world was changing again, and even the divine had to make room for what came next. The rivers remained the same, winding endlessly through the plains, glittering under the sun as they always had. The sky was still the same dome of gold and blue. The scent of rain on dry earth still stirred something old in those who felt it. But the names whispered beneath those skies began to shift. Where once farmers had called upon Ninurta to bless their crops, they now spoke of Marduk, of Shamash, of Nabu, gods who were newer only in name, but built from the same bones of the old faith. This was not erasure, it was transformation. When Sumer gave way to Akkad, and Akkad to Babylon, the stories travelled like seeds caught in the wind. They drifted from temple to temple, from one language to another, from one empire's certainty into another's vision. The people never stopped needing their gods. They simply adjusted them to fit the world they were building, a world growing larger, louder, more complex. Ninurta, the old warrior turned restorer, still lived in those shifting myths. His image softened, his deeds rewritten under new names. To the Akkadians he became Ningirsu, the god of canals and order, the one who taught them how to tame rivers and read the stars. In Babylon, fragments of his identity folded into Marduk, the rising king of gods who battled chaos and restored creation. Even the echoes of his weapon, Sharur, reappeared in other myths, as the lightning of Adad, as the voice of justice in the storms of later deities. It is strange how myth does not die, but migrates, how the essence of an idea can travel through centuries, losing its name but never its shape. The priests of the old temples must have seen this happening. They must have known that the hymns they recited to Ninurta would soon be sung for others. Some tried to preserve what they could, copying the ancient words onto new tablets, storing them in sealed chambers deep within ziggurats. They believed, perhaps rightly, that even if people forgot the name, the wisdom would remain hidden in the clay until someone remembered how to read it again. Others accepted the change more easily. They saw in the rise of new gods not loss, but continuity. The world, they said, was only reorganizing itself. The heavens were adapting, just as the earth always had. If Marduk now carried the tablets of destiny instead of Enlil, if Babylon now shone where Nippur once did, then perhaps it was simply the universe turning another page. Still, for those who remembered Ninurta as he had been, the protector, the teacher, the reconciler, the fading of his name carried a quiet ache. He had never demanded grand temples or loud devotion. His power had always been in silence, in patience, in the spaces between storms. Perhaps that made his disappearance inevitable. The gods who endure in memory are often those who demand attention, who promise triumph or threat. Ninurta promised neither. He offered understanding, and understanding rarely survives the noise of empire. The Babylonians were a people of ambition. They looked at the stars not with reverence alone, but with curiosity. They measured them, mapped them, built towers to mirror their positions in the heavens. Their gods reflected that reach. Magnificent, powerful, regal. Marduk in particular became the embodiment of divine authority, the ruler who defeated chaos and ordered creation through decree. The echoes of Ninurta's compassion, his humility, his quiet balance began to fade into the background. But myths are like rivers. Even when diverted, they still carry traces of their source. In the Enuma Elish, the great Babylonian creation epic, Marduk battles Tiamat, the dragon of chaos using storms and winds to shape the new world. It is in many ways Ninurta's story retold in another form, the same battle between chaos and order, the same weapon forged from storm and sound, the same act of restoration that follows destruction. Only the tone has changed. What was once introspection has become proclamation. What was once harmony has become hierarchy. The god who once walked among people as a guide has now ascended to rule above them as king. The world had grown, but in growing, it had also hardened. In the shadows of those grand new temples, though, something quieter endured. The old priests of Lagash, those who still kept the tablets of Ninurta's hymns, continued to light small lamps in his name. They did not resist the new order. They simply refused to forget. To them, memory was an act of faith. One fragment from that time, written in a mixture of Sumerian and Akkadian, reads, "Even if his name is spoken by none, his balance remains. The plough still turns the soil as he taught. The river still knows his rhythm." It is not a lament, but a reassurance. The belief that what has once been learned cannot be unlearned, that wisdom, once given, cannot be taken away by silence. In the city of Babylon, the temple of Esagila rose higher than any structure before it, its terraces layered like steps toward heaven. From its summit, priests would watch the sky, charting the paths of planets and stars. They saw in those patterns the same logic that had once defined Ninurta's teachings: balance, proportion, rhythm. They called it me, the divine order, the blueprint of the cosmos. They believed it flowed through everything, from the motion of stars to the growth of grain. It was, unknowingly, his legacy under a new name, and perhaps Ninurta himself, wherever such beings drift when no longer called upon, understood this. Perhaps he looked upon Babylon, upon the ziggurats gleaming in the sun, and felt no jealousy, no grief, only the satisfaction of a parent who sees the lessons once taught now practiced without needing his hand. The ancient texts hint at this idea in subtle ways. In one late hymn, possibly written centuries after his temples had fallen silent, the voice of Ninurta speaks not to people, but to time itself. The words, translated from fragments, are haunting in their simplicity. I am the pattern beneath the pattern. Names fade, but I remain in the balance of things. It's a strange thought, that even gods might evolve into concepts, into the invisible laws that govern the world. But that perhaps is the highest form of remembrance. As Babylon flourished, as empires rose and fell, as language itself changed shape, the memory of the old gods never truly vanished. They became the scaffolding upon which new beliefs were built. Their stories, rewritten, became the foundation for others. The flood of Utnapishtim became Noah's. The storm of Ninurta became the thunder of Zeus. The balance of Sumer's gods became the justice of later ages. Myth, after all, is not about ownership, it is about continuity. To the modern eye, it may seem that Ninurta disappeared. His temples crumbled, his statues shattered, his name lost among the countless deities that followed. But his essence, the lesson that strength and compassion can coexist, that balance must be tended, not enforced, remained woven through everything that came after. The philosophers of later civilizations, the scientists who sought order in chaos, the poets who wrote of renewal, all, in their way, carried forward a fragment of that ancient god's thought. When archaeologists began unearthing the ruins of Sumer thousands of years later, brushing dust from tablets that had not seen daylight since before Babylon's rise, they found his name again. Faint, worn, but still legible. They found prayers carved in careful hand. May Ninurta steady the plough, may he calm the river. They found depictions of his winged form, his hands open, not in command, but in offering. It must have been strange, in those first moments of rediscovery, to realize that this quiet god, nearly erased by history, had left behind such lasting marks. The stones remembered. The myths had simply been sleeping. There's something almost poetic about that. How even silence can keep a secret for millennia. In one sense, Ninurta's disappearance was the natural end of his story. His work had always been about restoration, not dominance. Once balance returned, his presence was no longer needed. The world he had helped rebuild was now self-sustaining. Humanity had learned to carry on without divine intervention, and in doing so they fulfilled the very lesson he had spent ages teaching. Perhaps the gods, like the storms, are meant to pass, to rise, to shape, to retreat, leaving behind the fertile calm that allows life to grow. As the centuries folded into one another, Babylon itself would fall. Its towers would crumble, its kings reduced to names in half-remembered chronicles. Yet the spirit of its order, its reverence for knowledge, its pursuit of balance, would ripple outward, carried by traders, scholars, travellers. Each new civilization would take what it needed from the old, reimagining the divine to fit its understanding. And in that long migration of memory, Ninurta's echo continued, subtle, persistent, timeless. Today, when we speak of rebuilding after destruction, when we speak of understanding rather than conquest, we echo him without knowing it. Every time someone mends what was broken, every time a field is restored after drought, every time patience overcomes force, that is his story retold. The forgotten god never truly vanished. He simply became part of the quiet laws that guide the world forward. The Sumerians used to say that to forget a god was not to erase them. It was to set them free, to let them dissolve into the air, the water, the rhythm of existence itself. That is perhaps the truest form of immortality. And so Ninurta, the warrior who saved humanity, the guardian who taught balance, became something greater than worship. He became the silence between storms, the order within chaos, the calm that allows creation to begin again. As you lie in the quiet now, as the night hums softly around you, think of that. How even things forgotten are never truly gone. How names may fade, but meanings endure. The same stars that watched over Sumer still shine tonight, their light crossing the same endless distance. The same rivers still find their way to the sea. The same pattern continues, and somewhere within that pattern, if you listen closely enough, the old rhythm still beats, steady, patient, unbroken. Not the sound of thunder anymore, but of memory. Not the roar of battle, but the whisper of understanding. The sound of a god who disappeared, and in doing so became everything. The night sky has always been a mirror. In its reflection, ancient people saw not just stars but stories. Gods, beasts, heroes, all arranged across the heavens as reminders of what once was, or what might be again. To look up for them was to look back. And somewhere within those constellations, among the shapes that guided sailors and storytellers alike, was the faint outline of a memory, the one they called Ninurta. But could there have been more to it than myth? Could the story of the forgotten warrior, the one who fought storms, floods, and even the wrath of heaven, have been rooted in something real? When scholars first began to piece together the Sumerian tablets, fragments found scattered across the ruins of Ur, Lagash, Nippur, and Eridu, they expected to find simple hymns, agricultural records, and prayers. What they found instead were patterns, complex, deliberate, and strangely consistent. Names, events, and symbols repeated across thousands of years, as if each generation was trying to remember something it only half understood. Ninurta's name appeared not just in myths, but in administrative texts, astronomical charts, and temple inscriptions. His weapon, Sharur, was sometimes described as a talking object, sometimes as a device of immense power, and sometimes as an instrument of measurement, something that could speak to the mountains and bring down the stars to the earth. The language of metaphor, yes, but the precision of it caught the attention of modern researchers. Could these have been echoes of something technological, a memory of tools or events beyond the comprehension of their time? To the Sumerians, the gods were never intangible. They walked, they ate, they built. They had families, tempers, rivalries. Their presence was physical, as real as the rivers that sustained the cities. Ninurta, especially, was described with a kind of grounded detail. He wasn't just a figure of faith. He was a craftsman, an engineer, a strategist. His myths speak not only of battles, but of the measuring of land, the creation of canals, the design of temples aligned with the stars. It's no coincidence that many of the oldest ziggurats in Sumer, including those dedicated to him, were built with astonishing mathematical precision. The angles, the alignments, the orientation toward solstices and star risings, all of it suggests an understanding of geometry and astronomy that seems far beyond what early civilization should have known. Archaeologists debate how much of that knowledge was empirical and how much symbolic. Some say the Sumerians simply observed the world carefully, recording cycles and relationships. Others suggest that their myths might encode memories of an earlier age, a forgotten civilization, or even contact with beings who carried advanced knowledge. It's speculation, but speculation has always been the doorway between history and imagination. What stands out most in Ninurta's story is his dual nature, both warrior and restorer, destroyer and healer. He fights chaos but never revels in it. He brings floods but also teaches how to survive them. He commands storms but later teaches the use of ploughs. In mythological studies, such figures are often described as transitional deities, ones that mark the passage from an older worldview into a new one. They represent change, evolution, transformation. For the Sumerians, who lived at the crossroads of prehistory and civilization, Ninurta may have been the symbolic embodiment of that transformation, the moment when humanity shifted from fear of nature to understanding it, from surviving the world to shaping it. But there's another quieter possibility that some researchers have begun to explore, that Ninurta's story might preserve the distant memory of an individual, a real person whose life and deeds were later mythologized beyond recognition. Sumerian kings often blurred the line between mortal and divine. The earliest rulers of the cities, Alulim, Alalgar, Dumuzid, and others named in the king list, were said to have reigned for impossibly long periods, sometimes tens of thousands of years. These were not literal numbers, but symbolic ones, meant to express greatness beyond measure. Could Ninurta have been one of them? A leader perhaps, who guided his people through disaster and reconstruction, whose deeds were remembered so vividly that over generations he became divine. The archaeological record offers a few intriguing clues. In Lagash, where Ninurta's temple stood, inscriptions from around 2400 BCE describe a ruler named Gudea, a king-priest who claimed to rebuild the temple of Ininu under the god's guidance. In his texts, Gudea speaks of dreams in which a divine figure showed him blueprints for sacred architecture. diagrams for canal systems, and instructions for ritual. He described the figure as the one whose weapon is voice and light. To modern ears that sounds mythic, perhaps poetic. But to the Sumerians, dreams were not imagination, they were communication. Many scholars believe Gudayar's vision of Ninurta might have been inspired by older stories passed down from even more ancient times. Stories of leaders or teachers who brought order after cataclysm. It's not impossible that the myth of the god and the memory of a man slowly merged, becoming indistinguishable. The flood stories, too, may preserve the memory of real events. Massive inundations that reshaped Mesopotamia around 6000 BCE, when rising sea levels transformed the Persian Gulf and submerged entire settlements. A leader who guided his people through such a crisis could easily become, in collective memory, a saviour of humankind. What's striking is how consistent the emotional tone of Ninurta's myth remains across thousands of years. Unlike many warrior gods of later empires, he is not defined by rage or conquest. His battles always serve balance. His victories are followed by rebuilding. His power is tempered by care. That emotional nuance feels deeply human, as if, beneath the divine narrative, there still beats the heart of someone who once lived and learned. Even his weapon, Sharur, might be symbolic of knowledge, something that cuts through confusion, that speaks, that bridges heaven and earth. Some researchers have compared its descriptions to early observations of sound or vibration. The understanding that resonance could shape matter, that voice itself could move the world. In that sense, the talking weapon becomes the metaphor for science. The discovery that nature can be understood, spoken with, rather than feared. If we look at the story that way, Ninurta becomes not just a god of storms, but a symbol of humanity's awakening. The moment we began to listen to the universe and realize that it could listen back. And perhaps that's what makes the question of his reality so enduring. Because whether or not there was ever a living being who bore his name, the lessons encoded in his myth are real in the truest sense. They describe a process every civilization and every person goes through. The movement from chaos to understanding, from destruction to creation, from fear to balance. Modern science, for all its precision, still carries traces of that ancient impulse. The desire to measure, to observe, to find order in the stars and the soil. These are the same instincts that built the temples of Sumer. When astronomers today chart the rotation of planets, or study the cycles of the Earth, they continue the same search for pattern that began when Ninurta taught farmers to watch the skies. Even the language overlaps. The word cosmos in Greek means order. The Sumerian concept of me carried the same meaning, the invisible laws that hold existence together. The bridge between myth and science, then, is not opposition, but continuity. Myth speaks in symbols. Science translates them into formulas. Both, in their own way, tell the same story, of minds trying to understand the vastness that surrounds them. So when we ask whether a Ninurta was real, maybe the better question is what kind of reality we mean. Historical, perhaps not in the literal sense, but as a reflection of human experience, as a vessel for our oldest questions. Absolutely. He represents something deeply familiar, the part of us that wants to bring harmony to a chaotic world, that wants to make sense of the storm. It's possible that one day, buried deeper still beneath the ruins of Sumer, archaeologists might find older tablets, older cities, older signs of knowledge that push our understanding even further back. And if they do, perhaps the line between myth and memory will blur even more. But maybe it's enough that the story still speaks, that somewhere in the quiet of a museum, under soft lights, a clay tablet still bears his name. That across 5,000 years the message has survived in faint, steady strokes. Balance is the law of all things. The Sumerians believed that knowledge itself was divine, that to learn was to draw closer to the gods, and so, in a way, every discovery we make, every new insight into the laws of the universe, is a continuation of their prayers. The scientist bending over a microscope, the engineer designing a bridge, the astronomer tracing the arc of a distant planet, all are part of the same lineage that once looked at the floodwaters and said, "Let us build again." And maybe, if Ninurta could see us now, our machines that fly, our networks of light, our endless attempts to rebuild and restore, he would recognize something familiar. The same curiosity, the same resilience, the same desire to bring order to the world without extinguishing its mystery. Because that, perhaps, was always the heart of his story. Not divine power, but understanding. The strength to fight the storm and the wisdom to know when to let it pass. If there is science behind the myth, it is this: that knowledge, like faith, is born from wonder. That we are always learning the same lesson in new languages, the lesson he once taught through thunder and silence alike. And as the night deepens, and the world outside slows into stillness, you can almost feel the continuity of that lesson. The hum of electricity, the pulse of the planet, the whisper of wind through leaves, all of it part of the same rhythm, the same equation that connects what was divine to what is human. Perhaps that's what the ancient storytellers meant when they said Ninurta never truly left. He simply became the laws themselves, the physics of kindness, the mathematics of patience, the quiet geometry of renewal. And in that sense, yes, he was real. Real in every storm that ends, real in every rebuilding that begins, real in every moment when understanding replaces fear. The warrior became wisdom. The myth became memory. The memory became the very structure of how we learn. And as you drift now through your own quiet, that same structure hums beneath you, steady, ancient, waiting. The science behind the myth and the myth behind all science, both whispering the same truth, that balance is not found, but made, again and again, each time the world remembers how to listen. The world we live in now moves faster than any that came before. Lights that never dim, voices that never stop, a constant, restless motion that fills every corner of our waking hours. And yet, beneath all of it, there's something that feels familiar, a tension that the ancients knew too well, the balance between creation and destruction, between noise and silence, between knowing and forgetting. It's the same balance Ninurta once guarded, the same fragile thread he fought to preserve long before his name became a whisper in broken stone. We don't tell stories of gods the way we used to. We have other names now for the forces that shape us: science, progress, technology, information. We call our creations by technical terms, but the rhythms are ancient. Every invention, every discovery, every new horizon brings the same question the Sumerians once asked of their heavens: can we control what we make, or only understand it? That question is why the memory of Ninurta still matters, because his story was never about domination. It was about restraint, about the understanding that power, without patience, turns creation into ruin. He was the warrior who learned to put down his weapon, the god who rebuilt instead of ruling. And though we have forgotten his name, we live inside the consequences of his lessons every day. When the first cities rose along the rivers of Mesopotamia, balance was survival. The floods that fed the soil could also destroy it. Too much rain meant famine, too little meant the same. The early priests of Ninurta stood at that intersection, not to beg the heavens for mercy, but to learn the pattern, to watch, measure, and adjust. Their rituals were less about magic than observation. They studied the flow of water, the alignment of stars, the pulse of seasons. It was faith through understanding, a kind of ancient science grounded in humility. And maybe that's what we've lost most today, that humility before complexity. We live in an age that celebrates control. We measure the world down to atoms, chart its forces, capture its energy, and yet we are still haunted by imbalance. Climate, conflict, exhaustion, division. The same chaos by different names. The tools have changed, but the patterns haven't. The storm still gathers, and the same old question returns. Who among us will choose to protect instead of conquer? Who will rebuild without demanding to be worshipped for it? That was Ninurta's role. Not the loudest god, not the most powerful, but the one who understood that every victory carries a cost, and every destruction leaves behind the need for care. His myth is the reminder that every civilization depends not just on those who build, but on those who restore. The ancient texts describe him as the one who steadies what trembles. It's a simple phrase, but it feels timeless. Because steadiness, that quiet, unglamorous act of balance, is still what the world most needs. In the temples of Lagash, the priests once told a parable about him that isn't found in the official hymns. It was passed orally from teacher to apprentice, long after the great ziggurats had begun to crumble. It said that once, long after the flood and the wars, Ninurta walked the earth in disguise. He came to a village where the river had dried up and found the people arguing. Some blamed the gods, others blamed each other. The fields were cracking and tempers with them. He listened quietly, then knelt in the dirt and began to dig. One by one, others joined him, and soon the water that had retreated underground began to rise again. When the fields were green once more, he left without a word. That was the lesson: to act without command, to heal without needing recognition, to restore without claiming ownership. It's a small story, but perhaps that's why it endured, because it felt reachable, human, and maybe it still should. The memory of Ninurta doesn't belong to myth alone. It belongs to anyone who chooses to build when it would be easier to break. When archaeologists uncovered the temple foundations of Enlil at Girsu, they found not gold or jewels, but hundreds of small clay offerings, figurines of farmers, oxen, ploughs, fish, birds, rivers, everyday things, objects of labour and life. They were tributes to the ordinary, to the balance of effort and reward. In that simplicity lies a quiet philosophy, that divinity lives in maintenance, not spectacle. It's a hard truth to hold in an age that measures meaning by scale. But perhaps that's why the old gods still echo, because they speak to what we forget. If Ninurta were remembered today, not as a myth, but as an idea, what would he say? Maybe nothing new, maybe something we already know but rarely practice. That strength is not force, but endurance. That protection means patience. That wisdom is less about answers than about listening. To the world, to each other, to the silences that tell us what words can't. He would probably remind us that rebuilding never ends, that every act of creation carries within it the need for care, and that balance is not something achieved once, but something practiced daily. In a sense, he has never left. His story is written into the ways we live, even if we no longer see it as sacred. When engineers design flood systems, when scientists work to restore ecosystems, when communities rebuild after disaster, they continue the work of that forgotten god, using knowledge as compassion, not conquest. Perhaps that's why, despite his fading from religion, Ninurta feels strangely modern. He was a god who evolved, a being who questioned his own authority, who disobeyed when obedience meant destruction, who sought peace not through dominance but through understanding. In that way, he was almost human, or perhaps humanity at its best is almost divine. There's a story, more fragment than text, found in a damaged tablet from the first millennium BCE. It describes a time when the gods grew weary of the noise of men. Enlil withdraws, Enki sleeps, and the heavens go silent. Only Ninurta remains awake, walking the earth in solitude. He does not command, he observes. He does not change the world, he listens to it breathe. It's a haunting image, and maybe that's the truest reflection of his nature. The protector who protects by presence, not power. The Sumerians believed that memory itself was a kind of immortality, that to speak a name was to give it life again. So perhaps it's enough that we still speak his story now, thousands of years after the last hymn faded. Each retelling, each rediscovery, is another heartbeat in the long sleep of a god who once cared too much to rule. But the deeper truth is that we never stopped needing him. The balance he stood for, between knowledge and humility, between progress and preservation, is the same balance that defines our age. We stand now, as they once did, at the edge of our own storms. The difference is that ours are of our own making. Floods still come, though now they have different causes. The skies still darken, the earth still shakes, the old fears return under new names, and each time we are reminded that the same wisdom still applies. To understand before acting, to mend before mastering. That is the memory of Ninurta. It's not a tale of miracles or power. It's a practice, a way of seeing the world not as something to conquer, but to collaborate with. A reminder that even gods in their myths had to learn how to listen to the things they tried to command. Sometimes, when archaeologists uncover fragments of his temples, they find inscriptions that seem oddly modest, for a god once described as mighty. One simply reads, "He kept watch so that the earth would rest." Another says, "He fought not to rule, but to renew." Those are not lines of fear or grandeur. They're reminders of purpose, quiet, enduring, essential. The world is filled with noise now, the constant hum of human progress, the rush of information, the pressure to always move forward. Yet in moments of stillness, when the lights dim and the rhythm of life slows, something older seeps through. The awareness that progress without reflection is just another kind of flood. And maybe that's when his voice returns, not in thunder, not in prophecy, but in calm realization. The gentle awareness that we have always been rebuilding the same world. The people of Sumer once prayed for steady rains, predictable harvests, safety from the flood. We pray in our own way for the same things: stability, clarity, peace. The language changes, the rituals evolve, but the longing remains. To remember Ninurta is to remember that longing, the human wish for harmony, for balance that lasts longer than a moment. It's to remember that we too are builders and restorers, inheritors of the same fragile duty that once belonged to the gods. If his story still matters, it's because it's ours now. It always was. Every generation faces its storms. Every age has to decide what kind of power it wants to wield, the power to dominate or the power to sustain. The first will always fade. The second, if tended, can last forever. The ancients built temples to hold their gods. We build systems, knowledge, communities. But the principle remains the same. What we build reflects what we value, and what we choose to care for defines who we become. That's why the memory of Ninurta should not vanish again, because we still need reminders that strength without gentleness is hollow, that progress without mercy is fragile, and that every storm, no matter how great, ends with the need to rebuild. He was called the son of Enlil, the keeper of storms, the bringer of order. But perhaps his truest title was the simplest, the protector who stayed when others left. And though the last temples have fallen and the clay tablets crumble quietly in museum drawers, the essence of his myth endures. It lives in every effort to make peace after conflict, in every scientist who studies the climate not to control it, but to understand it, in every person who sees a broken thing and chooses to mend it. The world still trembles, but the act of steadying it, of choosing compassion over chaos, is still possible. It always has been. Maybe that is why stories like his refuse to die, because they are not about the past at all. They are about continuity, about the part of us that keeps choosing balance no matter how many times it's lost. So tonight, as the hum of the world softens and the night folds in around you, remember the quiet warrior whose storms became songs, the protector who saw divinity not in power, but in care, the God who learned, as we must always learn, that the greatest strength lies in gentleness. The memory of Ninurta is not a relic. It is a rhythm, the sound of things enduring, the whisper of balance returning. And as the world turns and the rivers keep their flow, and the stars still watch from their endless distance, that rhythm continues, softly, patiently, eternally. Because some guardians never truly leave. They simply become the quiet between breaths, the silence that keeps the storm from starting again.